Okay, so let's get underway. Welcome, everyone. Officially declare the public session to begin. To remind everybody who may be joining us online, the session is being recorded, to be posted on the Waterfront Toronto website. We just have two items today on our agenda, but a few matters of business first. Just approval of the minutes from our last meeting.
Would you like to start with the land acknowledgement statement?
Oh, I didn't even see it up there. I'm sorry. My apologies. I'm facing the wrong way. So we'll just read the land acknowledgement, obviously. Waterfront Toronto acknowledges that the land upon which we are undertaking our revitalization efforts is part of the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. In addition, Waterfront Toronto acknowledges that Toronto has historically been a gathering place for many Indigenous people, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples today. Thank you. So just a couple of items of general business. Approval of the minutes. I have someone to move that. David, a seconder. Yeah, Fatty, thank you. Okay, today's agenda, just two items. McCleary District here for issues identification for the first time. After a little break, the detailed design on the Basin Media Hub. Is there anyone who has declare a conflict of interest on the panel, either in person or online? No, hearing none. Great, thank you. Okay, updates. Chris, from report back maybe on the last month's projects. Are you doing those?
Sure. Yeah, I can do these first. Yeah. So just a quick report back on the previous month's panel review project. So Quayside came for a preliminary draft plan. They are advancing the rezoning application and they're anticipating a submission later this month. And as soon as they receive, the zoning approval, they will begin the design of the first building. So we're forecasting a Q3 return to the panel for schematic design for the first building. And along with that first review, we will also see an updated draft design guidelines. Also, last month we saw Parliament slip activation coming back for issues identification. So the team is in the process of just wrapping up the cost estimate as the final step of this 10% design stage. And the project will basically go on hold, will be paused until funding becomes available. And a quick update on our nearby construction site, Queens Quay East, Lakeville. So, as part of the Quayside project, Waterfront Toronto will be extending Queens Quay East, including a new intersection with a realigned Parliament Street. So to facilitate this work, the head of the slip will be filled in. What you see in the photograph there is the current stage of construction. So you can see the new edge of the dock wall, which has been set in the water there. And the team, after this step, will begin dredging some of this area of the debris and kind of take it off before they actually put in the new fill to complete the lake fill. And the timeline is hopefully end of the year, the lake fill will be complete. And just looking ahead for the next 2 months, for April, we will have Villiers Island density and massing study come back for information. And then 1 to 7 Yonge, phase 4 and 5. That project, we saw it last year, but there's a substantial redesign. So we're going to see it again and schematic design. And in May, we have 3 projects on the agenda, West Don Lands Block 13, and potentially McCleary District coming back for the first preliminary draft plan review, and also the Waterfront Toronto Accessibility Framework for information. I think that's it, Paul.
That's it. Okay. We're right on time again, so thank you very much. So we'll move to our first item, McCleary District Precinct Plan, Issues ID, and Paul
Arcolander?
Arcolander, yeah, project manager, Great TO is gonna introduce it, so. where are you?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right, okay.
Yeah, I'll speak usually because Colin is actually gonna lead us off with the first group of the slides, but my name is Paul Arclander. I work for Great TO and project manager there, leading us with the McCleary District Precinct Plan, which we're just getting underway with. So I will let Leon bring the slides up and just pass it to Colin to start us off.
Yes, please just give me 1 second here and
Yeah. Hi, Millie.
please come on in. Hello.
Great, you'll just flip the slides now?
Very good.
Yes, yeah, I will advance slides for you. Sure. Let's just give people 1 second to settle.
Yeah.
Hey, how are you?
Spending the evening.
We're gonna be there as well. So.
Yes. Are you there? Yeah.
Are you at a safe?
Not on the stage.
No, Carly. She got voluntold to be on the stage.
Carrie.
I also thought Carrie would be.
I would have thought Carrie would be too, no? Table, are you in?
You're Me neither. I'm sure we'll have a conversation.
Materials.
Or is it Leon Connect Control? It's not like that. Yeah, I'll just keep it cute. Yeah.
See if they're doing triple glazing.
Yeah.
Okay, great to see everyone. My name is Colin Wolf. I'm a senior planner with the city of Tweed. I'm supporting Create TO, who's the lead on the McCleary District Precinct Plan. So I'm helping coordinate on the city side. Great to see everyone. Before we jump into it, I think it's important to set the stage with this precinct plan is implementing many years of planning and analysis. It's an implementation exercise. We know that the Port Lands planning framework behind it has been going on for a very long time. Recognizing it's also a new day, holding in council direction and optimizing the public land. So the planning direction remains relevant, and how we marry that together with more ambitious housing and film and productions, creative uses is the challenge before us. Next slide, please. So as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the McCleary District, shaded in red, is just to the east of the rerouted Don Valley. It is a productions, interactive, and creative mixed-use area. And just as a quick refresher, the PIC idea, productions, interactive, and creative, is actually a fairly broad suite of uses. It is focused on film, but you can have studio there, you can have academic uses, there could be technology uses, there could be laboratory uses. So this idea of productions, interactive, and creative is maybe a more broad than the name might suggest. So that's just something I wanted to set the stage there with. The district will grow into a complete community with tall and mid-rise buildings. And we're kind of refining how that built form plays out. And then finally, there's the precinct planning will establish local street and block patterns, parks, and open spaces, and community infrastructure. There are some unknowns, as we're going to get into, in terms of how the right-of-ways are deployed in this area, and will make for some interesting work in the phase 2. Next slide, please. So in the existing context, I think the most important piece here is McCleary Park. We know that it's a priority from Parks and Recreation to maintain the programming of that area for large sporting and recreation purposes. We know that there's few opportunities to do that throughout the city, so that's something to keep in mind. And also we have the 400 commissioners, waste transfer station, and an incinerator stack, which we'll get into a little bit more. Next slide, please. So the existing context, what's important to understand here, that at least 80% of the district is under public ownership. What you're seeing in yellow here are private landowners. So that's important. In terms of, we have a active development application at 685 Lakeshore Boulevard East. And then I'll flip to the next slide to talk a little bit more about the bigger picture of the area. We'll walk through a few images here. This is starting from looking south from the northeast, the edge of the park. Next slide, please. Here we are at Commissioners looking northwest. Next slide. And this is looking from commissioners at the Don roadway, and that will look quite a bit different with the renaturalization. And now we're looking down, this is flanking the McCleary Park. This is at the existing alignment of Bouchette. Next slide, please. And this is looking south to Pinewood Studios and some of the PIC core film uses of the district to the south. Next slide. So this helpful graphic helps us illustrate where McCleary fits into what our consultants are calling the nexus of the neighborhood. To the north, we're seeing employment-focused areas at East Harbor. Of course, Villiers Island that had a lively discussion last night at the community consultation meeting, and that's residential focused. South of that, we're looking at Basin Media Studios and some of the more PIC core sort of uses. And so that's where McCleary fits in. And then, of course, the rerouted Don Valley and the park network. And so that's where McCleary District fits into the broader picture of the neighborhood. So what's driving us now? Why is this coming to the panel now? And why are we advancing it now? The short story is we have development applications and some of the private landowners are wanting to get some surety in terms of how they fit into the bigger picture. So there's development pressures. And so we want to ensure that our precinct planning captures development interests and that we're cross-pollinating with them. And so it fits into the bigger picture. So that's one of the big drivers for why this is advancing now. What we're seeing here, important to understand, what you're seeing in blue is what we're calling phase 2. So we've carved this precinct plan into 2 distinct phases. The reason for doing so is phase 1 captures the privately owned lands, and we feel like we can get close enough with streets and blocks to get a pretty good idea of how built form relates to public realm. And then some of the unknowns, which I'll get to in the next slide, are pushed off into the second phase, which looks at McCleary Park and some of the remnant lands impacted by the Broadview extension. So the phase 2 issues to be resolved are complex issues happening in a parallel track. So the Broadview extension, the new east-west street, and the future alignment of Bouchette are all being determined through an environmental assessment process that's ongoing. Even though Bouchette's a local road, so those 3 pieces, east-west, Broadview, and Bouchette, are not small pieces that need to be determined through environmental assessment processes. And so that is we're buying ourselves a bit more time by pushing some of that work to phase 2. And then finally, another not small issue with the 400 Commissioners Waste Transfer Station. It has land use compatibility issues with the incinerator stack and residential uses. So we have to find a way to reconfigure and modernize that facility in order to unlock residential uses, and that's within the policies in the Central Waterfront Secondary Plan. So that's an important piece, and it's not small. So that's also being pushed to the second phase of the precinct plan. Next slide, please. Lots going on in terms of planning context. The most important is that our second Central Waterfront Secondary Plan saw a settlement for the majority. I think 95% of the policies were settled at the Ontario Land Tribunal in 2022. That's all in force policy. We're also looking to, we're actively coordinating with the Productions Interactive and Creative Core Design Guidelines to advance this as a single comprehensive suite of planning tools. So that's an important piece of coordination that this panel has seen before. And then finally, over and above the planning context, we're seeing that the housing action plan, generational housing, and this idea of optimizing the use of public land. And so we have to marry those 2 things together throughout the precinct planning process. Next slide, please. So part of the urban design vision informing the Portland's planning framework and some of the exploration and questions you'll be seeing today has a lot to do with how we experience the industrial heritage and the stacks, right? So going down from the view from B down is looking to the Hearn stack, and then the views from A and C are considering views to the McCleary incinerator stack. So that industrial heritage and those view corridors are part of what determined the built form strategy that came forward in the framework. And it's important to note that the incinerator stack is happening at the north of the east-west street. So that's where that's aligned, and that's the view priority coming out of the framework. Next slide. Also part of the urban design context laid out in the demonstration plan in the Portland's planning framework giving a notional built form kind of arrangement, is the highest buildings are happening at the Dawn Roadway and Lakeshore, transitioning down in height towards the park, the southeast. And part of the rationale for why built form is arranged in that manner is to protect for sunny, inviting public spaces, especially on the two parks. And it enhanced views to the chimney stacks. So that's why we saw that baseline guidance in the planning framework. And what you're seeing in the yellow circles here is the park network that the built form strategy should be flowing out of to protect for and enhance. Next slide, please. And finally, I think it's important to end off with the idea that McCleary District is unique. It's not Villiers Island, it's not East Harbor, and it's not Media City. It has elements of each, but the McCleary District is, what makes it unique is this careful balance of land uses to incorporate the PIC uses, again, broader than studios and broader than sound stages, to incorporate that 25% base requirement within the block. That's something we're looking at and refining through the precinct planning work, but that's what makes this district unique, is that careful balance of land uses. And finally, we're implementing the enforced policy while trying to keep pace with the housing needs and other council directions. So with that, I'll pass it on to Paul.
So Colin laid out some of the urban design vision and mentioned that we are taking the direction from the planning framework and extending that through this work. So I'm just going to briefly walk through some of the additional direction from the planning framework that's already established. So the image you can see here is the street network with the major streets highlighted with their widths, just to give you an idea of the edges and the corridors that we have in this district. The Dawn Roadway on the west side is actually being delivered right now through the Portland flood protection work. So that street will be completed with some nice planting and mixed use trail. Commissioners on the southern edge is going to be a transit corridor in the future with an LRT plan to come along there. It's also the interface between this district and the PIC core or studio districts to the south. So that's an important consideration for us that we'd like you to weigh in on as well. Broadview is kind of seen as the central spine of the district, coming down from East Harbor to the north. And we have a new east-west street. As Colin mentioned as well, all of these colored roads, except for Dawn Roadway, will be, we're going to do conceptual designs, but they'll be designed in detail through future environmental assessments. Next slide. On here, the important thing to highlight, I think, is that McCleary is going to be a very well-connected district in the future. So just 400 meters north of the district along Broadview will be the East Harbor Transit Hub. The streetcar is envisioned to come down, the LRT, to come down Broadview and across Commissioners in the future. So compared to some of the other areas of the Portlands, this will be a very well-connected district by transit and with cycling, major cycling routes as well. Next slide. In the Parks and Open Space Plan, especially in our phase 1, there is a new large district park envisioned, and our consultant team will speak more to some early explorations with how to program and orient that park later on. But the planning framework really speaks to the importance of connecting these open spaces to the public realm, especially to the new river valley that we'll have to the west and to the existing McCleary Park on the east side of the district. We also have a series of social infrastructure plan, including an elementary school, a new community center and hub, potentially a fire station, childcare centers, and expanded park space, I've already mentioned. Next slide. So Colin also mentioned briefly one thing that sets this district apart from Villiers is the land use. So rather than a residential focus, we will obviously have residential uses here, but there's a strong non-residential focus with these PIC or production, interactive, and creative uses. So some of the work we'll be doing in the precinct plan is exploring the retail and commercial activation opportunities. So these are the primary and secondary retail streets that were laid out in the planning framework that we'll be reconfirming or revisiting through this work. And also exploring those PIC uses that Colin mentioned and sort of the demand for those and how we can incorporate them into this district with mixed uses and sort of land use compatibility challenges that the consultants will also be speaking to. And just going to reiterate again that the screen-based industries are an important part of PIC mixed use, but it is a broad category that also includes some green and knowledge-based industries and light manufacturing that we'll also be looking at. Next slide. In terms of sustainability, we're carrying on with the direction of the planning framework and the city's net zero strategy. And we have these 7 areas of focus that we'll be exploring with sustainability consultants that Waterfront Toronto will be bringing on board and spearheading. Next slide. And I'll just wrap up with a couple of slides about our project team and our overall schedule. So as Colin mentioned, CreateTO is leading the process, working with the City of Toronto and Waterfront Toronto. And we do have a strong consultant team here with us today that will lead you through the rest of the presentation, including Perkins and Will, Diamond Schmitz, RWDI, DTAH. We're doing some additional procurement right now, and we'll have the rest of our consultant team on board hopefully next month or early in the next quarter. Next slide. And because this is the first opportunity we have to bring the McCleary district sort of to a public view, we just want to mention that we do have a robust engagement strategy planned as well. So there is Indigenous engagement planned, which is being incorporated into a broader Portland's lens with Villiers Island and some of the other engagement that's been going on with the core urban design guidelines with the next phase of waterfront revitalization. So that Indigenous engagement will be occurring over the next few months with a series of sharing circles and looking at some themes for really bringing Indigenous presence to the Portlands. And for the broader public engagement as well, we have these 6 themes that we'll be focusing on to get the public's feedback and stakeholders' feedback on all the issues and opportunities in this district. Next slide. So overview of the timeline, we are working on a pretty aggressive schedule here, but this is our first appearance at the panel. We'll be coming back here over the summer and the early fall for the next stages of the design review panel process. As I mentioned, we'll be doing our public and Indigenous engagement starting next month and continuing over the course of the project. But the key deadline we've set for ourselves is wrapping up the precinct plan with enabling zoning bylaw and official plan amendments by the end of this year. So that's what we're working towards. Next slide. And the last thing I'll leave you is just some of the considerations the project team would like the panel to weigh in on. So I mentioned some of the unique aspects, and Colin spoke to the unique aspects of this district. So it would be good to hear your opinion on sort of opportunities in built form and design related to the specific character of McCleary. We'd like to hear about your thoughts on connecting the public room, the park and river valley and adjacent spaces. We'd like to hear about your ideas of where we should be prioritizing sun exposure and making sure that there's particularly comfortable microclimate within the district. And also just thinking about the scale and density of the district and how that how we can support the vision for this dense transit-oriented district in the Portlands. And with that, I think that's the end of our presentation. I'll pass to Paul from Perkins and Will to take you through the rest.
Okay. I think you can. Are you in the meeting? Did you join your computer? If you join, then you can control the slides. I think it may be better that way. You so you connect to a Wi-Fi here. Give us a minute here.
Just need the password.
Yeah.
That's here.
If you want to plug in, you can plug in here. And just sit up here.
I'm on board right there.
Just make sure you are muted. Yeah, it's okay. Somebody share. Yes.
What are you doing?
Permission.
It's good to see you.
Do you want me to just call her?
If you can present. I can't seem to get it.
Because I'm just.
We can just keep going.
I think it's a good question. I don't think.
Duncan, you have permission to share now?
Yep. Excellent. All right.
Right.
Should I get started, Leon?
Yeah.
Please.
Great. Well, welcome. Thank you, everybody. Paul Cooley at Perkins and Will. I'm joined by Brent Raymond at Deton, Dr. Bates from Diamond Schmidt. Collectively, we're charged along with the team that's sitting here with us and the other consultants that Paul mentioned in developing this precinct plan. I will start with a little bit of an intro. Maybe I'll turn myself so I can see what I'm presenting. Thank you. Just skip. Let's just look at the history, sure. So we'll start with a little bit of the background, and I think many of you are familiar with this, but we know that the Portlands and the Don River itself have been traditional territories as well as treaty territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The river and the wetlands that would have been at its mouth were an important part of not only sort of movement, transportation, but also the livelihoods of the peoples that lived here. The area was also home to many other indigenous peoples, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. And part of that legacy is something that's part of the broader Indigenous engagement strategy that Paul mentioned and Waterfront Toronto has been obviously participating in for over a decade. And so our work will plug into that process, and we will be looking at active ways to integrate both those histories, but also reconciliation and moments to look at the kind of contemporary urban Indigenous population and how that impacts and reflects back on the precinct plan. All that said about water, I think we're also familiar with the history that this is largely an area built on landfill. And so that is the kind of erasure of that history and then the kind of manufactured industrial landscape that was created here that we are working with. And again, reconstructing in parts through things like the Portlands protection work. And this is another element and layer of the work that we will be considering. The McCleary district is just off to the right in the pink, but we start to see elements like the cultural landscape of Commissioner Street that borders our site, the Keating Channel that is on the edge of our site, but also some of the built heritage like the incinerator that Paul and Colin mentioned that is located squarely within the center of our work and will find its way. And so while these things may seem a little bit abstract and distant, they do shape our work. So things like the high water table impacts where we put parking, it impacts how we deal with stormwater, it impacts where we plant trees and how we plant trees. So these things are elements of the work we're considering. Next slide, just looking broadly at the context. This is from roughly the border of phase 1 and 2 that was described, looking to the west. And so you can start to see the two parcels here are the two Create TO publicly owned parcels currently used for soil storage. And so obviously not the highest and best use, but bound by the massive investments like the new work at Villiers Island, the flood protection, and then to the south, the investments around Pinewood Studio. So you can see the work happening around the edges, and then just behind us, all the investments around East Harbor. Next slide just looks in the opposite direction, sort of from the Don roadway looking back to the east. And so we can see the stack of the McCleary or the Commissioner's incinerator, the Hearn in the distance, and that's kind of one of those critical alignments along the future Broadview that's been discussed. And then again, the kind of Pinewood Studios and some of the economic development activity that's already there to the south. The areas sort of right in the middle between Salter and Bouchette, those are largely the three privately held parcels, one of which is subject to a public application. Others we expect will follow very shortly, and sort of largely the genesis of why the work is happening immediately at this moment.
Paul,
next slide.
do you mind speaking up a little bit? I think some folks at the back are
Sure.
having a little bit of trouble hearing.
All right. Jed, can you hear me? All right. So yeah, just zooming out and Duncan, I'm just going to trust that you're advancing behind me. When we zoom out, this is a bit of a composite view, and it's sort of a snapshot in time around where we are with the updates to the various precincts. And so I think it's important to know that since the PLPF, things have evolved. The Quayside work is in the process of implementation. Keating Channel Precinct is going to be subject of a upcoming review. Villiers is wrapping up a review. Pinewood to the south has now got some formal approvals around what's happening to the south. And then obviously East Harbor in gray has got some very significant density approved, as well as a mix of both residential and employment uses, and then the massive investments in both Ontario Line, GO Transit Station, and that's going to be a kind of magnet that attracts people along that Broadview streetcar from this precinct to the terminal and then the broader city and region beyond. So with all of that in mind, we've sort of broken things up into a series of explorations. I'll be talking very quickly about the vision guiding principles. Brent's going to walk us through a little around the public realm, resilient urban fabric, we've called it, and then Duncan will walk us through explorations in height, density, form, and how those intertwine with those PIC uses, because there are very deliberate. These aren't kind of generic offices that we're necessarily talking about, and they have spatial impacts on the work we're doing. So stepping into this work, we're very kind of conscious that McCleary is a precinct at the crossroads. I think Colin and others have called it a nexus. It combines elements of its neighbors, both in use, form, landscape, and infrastructure. It's also a bridging element that connects through green spaces from the river to McCleary Park, from the north to the south, but it's also centered around a local park, so the new park right at the core. But it's also a center of production and employment, so a relatively high percentage of employment uses relative to some of the other places, and then simultaneously providing homes for new families. And so really we think it's a precinct that's big enough and strong enough, bold enough, whatever we want to call it, broad enough to be both and finding that right mix and the kind of combination of those is sort of what we've been tasked with. Now, we're not starting with scratch. The Portland's planning framework did describe McCleary as, and pardon some of the jargon, I'm not going to read this all, but a dense, transit-oriented, complete mixed-use community that's a hub of activity, more largely mid-rise, and that's kind of one of the questions we're going to be looking at, that contributes to the broader economic objectives. So that's all those PIC uses, and then bookended by two open spaces. So the existing park and then the new river that's being built or has been opened on the west side. And then the new central park that I touched upon, with sort of a distinct perimeter at the Don Roadway, Lakeshore, etc., with excellent sunlight. So a real focus on kind of high quality pedestrian comfort, and then some allocation or allowance for taller buildings towards that northwest corner. We've sort of reimagined that as a sort of vision, as a nexus is the word, open to suggestions. I'm not married to this, but again, looking to create a vibrant, inclusive, mixed-use community that combines those production and interactive uses and is centered around a new central park. I won't read this through word for word. Happy to hear your feedback, but really this is what we're building off of and open to some suggestions. These then break down into 6 guiding principles that are informed and flow from the Portland's planning framework. Very briefly walk you through the idea of completing or creating a complete community with homes of all sizes. So we're really trying to address the affordability work with this, and we do think there are opportunities to create highly livable communities here. That includes affordable and family-oriented housing. We want to foster those economic development opportunities, so the PIC uses in a symbiotic relationship with what's happening to the south, but also what's happening to the north and in other directions, and trying to define not only the land use descriptions, but what are the physical shape of a PIC use. And Duncan's going to walk us through a bit of what that may look like. And then sort of flowing from that, we want to incorporate a variety of building forms that also are prioritized through design excellence. Fourth, we're looking at sort of a walkable, varied street network, and Brent's going to walk us through how we're looking to maybe inflect some of those elements of the grid. We know we've got a number of constraints around environmental assessments, existing infrastructure, and so on, but we think there are opportunities to evolve some of that and add the level of detail. And then number 5, we're looking to enhance the Indigenous presence at the Portlands and including the range of First Nations, Inuit, Métis traditions, culture, and worldviews. And then lastly, supporting a dynamic and resilient community. And so there's a lot of opportunities to integrate some blue-green infrastructure, really define what that central park looks like, how it combines with the more maybe regional orientation of McCleary Park to the side, and then in the fullness of time, how that integrates with a future community hub or other use in the current incinerator. And so with that, I'm just going to hand things over to Brent.
Thank you, Paul. Brent Raymond with PKH. I'm not Colin Berman, who was to present this, but I'm filling in while he's traveling. So resilient urban fabric. Duncan, if you could move forward. So just to reflect on what the planning framework shows at this point, a large central park as part, taking up an entire block as part of that structure plan, with a series of privately owned public spaces in east-west direction, connecting the existing McCleary Park to the Don River. A number of other elements in this around protected cycling, definitely on all the major streets, certainly safe cycling on all of the streets, but these are dedicated facilities. And opportunities for the inclusion of other elements, green infrastructure within the streets. The primary focus being on this proposed northeast-west street that is one block up from Commissioners. So this is our starting point. Next, please. As we've heard from others, that there are a number of other elements as part of this. The overall stormwater system strategy that's part of the Transportation and Servicing Master Plan defines how they plan to introduce infrastructure both below grade and above grade. So the idea of different types of green infrastructure on specific streets, open channels, closed channels, dealing with overflow, all of that is part at a very high level as part of that master plan. Please. There are a number of constraints below grade because this is an existing territory with infrastructure in the ground right now, as well as planned extension of infrastructure to serve the growing community. A lot of utilities along Lakeshore, along the existing Bouchette Street that we will see being introduced on the proposed. Salter Street has a lot of infrastructure within it, as does Commissioners. So this does define and works with the existing street and block framework established in the planning framework. Next, please. When we take a look at the park that's been proposed in the planning framework, it's about 0.7 hectares. So looking at similar parks of scale throughout the city of Toronto, we're going to focus on two, just to get an idea of what is the type of program that fits within that existing space. And the first one is St. Andrew's Playground and Park. Paul or Duncan, if you can move to that. It's at just a little bit smaller, 0.6 hectares. And what we can fit in that, next, please. It's not considered a large park. We have a playground, we have places for social activities, there's an off-leash dog area. But this program, people are familiar with what the scale is. This is what fits in effectively the scale of park we're talking about. Next. And it is a pleasant place, and it's certainly a popular destination within the city. The second is at David Crombie, the central block where, and even though it's going through a master plan process and a revitalization, the middle block where the basketball courts are right now, it's a block long, it's about the same scale. So again, not a lot of program fits within that space. We also wanted to talk about the arrangement of having a park with streets on all four sides. Now, what we're seeing in a lot of master plans of a scale similar to this one at 2150 Lakeshore Christie Cookie is that the park doesn't have streets on all four sides, that there is development that has an address on the park itself. So this particular example has streets on two sides, development on two others. Next, please. And you get to see that the type of program and activities that are possible within it. Next, the Hangar District, which is the first being constructed up at Downsview, a similar arrangement for a park where there's this interface between development and the park to create an important synergy. Next, Scarborough or Cloverdale Mall, where development is actually fronting on two sides of the park, the streets on two sides, with a private street in between. And then lastly, in Scarborough Junction, where there's very much a smaller street frontage that's on this. It's sandwiched in between the railroad and the street, and then development on both sides. So this is just a taste of what's happening at these larger scale developments. So some of our objectives in exploring how can we refine the public realm framework here is really to look at how we can connect open space that is planned within the overall Portlands. How can we better integrate the parks with the neighborhood around it? And then making some refinements, not necessarily to the street and block framework, but perhaps the use within those spaces. And then our secondary objectives are really tied to use. How can we rationalize the retail component of this? The planning framework had a very specific direction. I think that Duncan will touch on this a little bit through his built form, as well as Tate Economics, who are doing the retail work that will help to support all of this. And then lastly, supporting PIC uses. And what we'll see is that there's some challenges to achieve the public realm framework as defined in the planning framework document because of some of the built form implications. So how do we make adjustments, but still satisfy the principles of the planning framework? So where we might deviate a little bit, and again, this is what the planning framework is showing. Next, please. And just diagrammatically, it's about a central park along a spine with a series of popped spaces within the central part of the block. So this idea of this central park is one that we support, but is it really one that is best served by having public rights of way on all four sides? So next, please. We have a series of explorations. First is expand it. So how can we make a larger park and maybe redefine what some of these spaces could be? Next. So the idea of pushing a little bit from the north out east or the north on the new east-west street to create a broader segment of the street on the northern side that's connected to the park. Then to push the park into one of the public rights of way that's defined. By doing that, we increase the park by 20%, which is a fairly significant amount. And because this is a intensifying area, we do need to consider perhaps how we can get some more public space. Next, please. So again, tying it back to the opportunities around landscape character and performance, that we can start to introduce broader, more generous green infrastructure and very stronger character defining components into the public realm. Next, please. The second is to expand plus. So this idea, next please, of expanding in both directions into the public rights of way, perhaps fully taking over the street on one side and then adjusting the character on another, and then carving out some pop spaces, some plazas or other aspects on the northern side to create a sequence of different types of experiences. Next, please. So some of the ideas here, the way that Scott Street works on the west side of Bursey Park is a great example of a street that doesn't necessarily serve a major transportation role, but it's very much connected to the identity of the park. And then this idea that we've been exploring in the Christie Cookie project of what we're called Largos. So at those moments where it's in the private property, but you're creating these opportunities to broaden the public realm experience. Next, please. And then the double expand. The idea of, next, taking over both of the rights of way. Now, what this does is actually expand the park by close to 50% over what's in the planning framework. There are some implications to this because it does have an impact on the transportation network for vehicles. Is that a suitable trade-off to expand parks and do that? Next. And then the last exploration is shift, where, and again, Duncan will speak a little bit to this in the built form implications. But do we shift it south and take over that block that fronts on Commissioners? The benefit of this is that it does help mitigate some of the shadow and overlook issues that we're confronted with in the planning framework within the film studio precinct. However, it does put a park on a far busier street than it would have been if it's in the central block. Next. So this is just a summary of the four options that we've been studying. I'll pass it off to Duncan.
Thanks, Brent. Thanks, Paul. Duncan Bates, a senior associate with Diamond Schmidt Architects, and I'll walk through a similar series of explorations based on the existing framework of the PLPF as we understand it, and test some ideas. And I think really raise some areas where we see opportunity for further exploration. And I think seek feedback from this group. So the PLPF, as drafted and as massed, continues to emphasize a focus of height and therefore density to the northwest, focusing at the corner or the intersection of Dawn and Lakeshore, maintaining this park in the center of the McCleary district, as Brent has shared, and predominantly focusing on a low to mid-rise development fronting commissioners. So really an emphasis of height along Lakeshore and Dawn, and then a really tailored low to mid-rise through the balance of the McCleary district. That PLPF framework results in approximately 5.5 million gross square feet. When we look at the PIC use requirements and the retail requirements, we're about 1.3 million and about 250,000 respectively of total GFA distributed throughout the McCleary district. So not an insignificant amount of non-res use. When we think about the priorities and the considerations and the various levers that are focused on what opportunities exist in this, we refer to the public realm comfort, or ensuring or maximizing or increasing public realm benefit and comfort, sunlight, views to the McCleary stack. So Brent has shared a couple of considerations as it relates to the public realm, one of which contemplates expand, and that's expanding the new east-west street to the north. By doing that, it creates a framework to preserve a view to that stack. Avoiding overlook to the film uses to the south. Optimizing the use of public land, as Paul has shared and we've heard about in the introduction, and implementing, of course, the housing action plan. And I think that that's perhaps one of the biggest drivers in today's conversation. What is an appropriate increase, or is an increase in density appropriate in McCleary district? Are the opportunities there, and should we be looking at them? So when we think about that 5% retail service use, 250,000 square feet of space at scale, it represents approximately this on the site. Now, of course, as Colin has referred at the beginning of the conversation, Tate Economics is currently engaged undertaking retail and business analysis for the McCleary district. The PLPF speaks to retail dominant streets as being the Broadview extension, which I think we all agree makes a lot of sense. It also speaks to using Commissioner Street. And I think in light of some of the work that Brent has done, we're beginning to think of something slightly different. And a retail, utilizing retail as an opportunity to animate some of these other public realm gestures. So again, looking at a distribution along Broadview per the PLPF, but perhaps shifting some of the retail use off Commissioners and onto the new east-west street, prioritizing that as a predominant east-west neighborhood axis. PIC use is a significant one. As we can see, 1.3 million square feet distributed across McCleary. It's important to note that that's phases 1 and 2 by aggregate. So this isn't exclusively phase 1. The PLPF defines the distribution of PIC use as being 25% allocation per block. I think that's really important to think about how the PIC uses and potential residential uses, and possibly even an increase in residential use may hybridize on each of these blocks. And is that in fact the right approach to land allocation? What does PIC use look like? Our blocks are typically in the vicinity of about 70 to 90 by about 120 meters. Is it a black box studio, isolated in the center of a block in a core, wrapped with a retail, a residential, or a commercial application otherwise? It could work. The downside is that there are some conflicts with users. There would be some issues with privacy, security, intellectual properties, acoustics, a number of issues, but it certainly can be done. And we have seen some ideas of how that could be implemented in McCleary. Alternatively, a freestanding Spadina-like warehouse A 15-meter separation, standard City of Toronto tall building design guideline approach. Is this the most appropriate allocation of PIC use throughout the McCleary district? And by doing so, are we able to hit our density targets? The answer simply is not quite. We do need to provide or allocate for or find opportunities for more height. And a third scenario could be a hybridized version of the first two, or certainly the second, and that's a very familiar and very frequent application in the neighborhood here, a podium application of PIC use with res above. There will, of course, be a conflict of shared use cores and combining structural approaches that may differ from one application to the other, but it is a familiar typology that is commonplace throughout, certainly the lakeshore. As Paul had alluded to previously, and as we're all well aware, the Portlands does suffer from, or is the product of, a high water table as infilled land. Taking an approach that contemplates below grade parking will prove to be fiscally quite onerous, I suspect. Bathtubbing is a premium. Are there alternatives for contemplating parking? And how does this weave into the application of density and the contemplation of some of the PIC uses? Can we shift the parking into the podia, say at level 1 or at level 2 and up? What does that do? Obviously, there's a displacement of density, resulting in taller heights, taller podia. And how do we do this in a manner that continues to benefit some of our initial priorities, which are focused on creating a positive public realm? So what does the parking garage get wrapped in to maintain that? Is it a residential wrapper? What is it? So I'll leave on this diagram that shows what that might be, shows an idea of a single loaded corridor, perhaps around the perimeter, some rooftop, private access. All of this is to say, in combination with PIC use and parking at a very, very preliminary stage, we are looking at a building typology that is quite different from what the PLPF prescribed, which was a framework of courtyard buildings, interconnected courtyards, a string of pearls that would lead from the Dawn roadway right through to the existing McCleary Park. Rights of way, in contemplating a potentially taller podium condition by shifting, whether it be PIC use or parking into the building proper, will result in taller podia. That does have a negative or potentially negative impact on the public realm. Using a simple 80% width of, or 80% of right-of-way width to scale podia, but cognizant of the density targets, if we were to look at tapering simply the south facade or the north facade of the southern buildings, and tailoring and shaping and sculpting those buildings, creating outdoor space, but allowing daylight to penetrate deep into the right-of-way at its narrowest. And the 18-meter right-of-way I'm sharing here is the existing right-of-way of Villiers Street, the narrowest of them all on the McCleary district. As we're aware, there is a current application. It may have been adjusted recently. We understand it to be 2 36-story towers. It may be something slightly different. This is deviating from the PLPF in so much as it's a shift in the height. With this move in place and perhaps a subsequent update to this move, it does begin to tease the question, what are further considerations for additional height in McCleary district to support some of the other objectives? Thinking about the site sections, a section from east to west, or west to east, west on the left. So Dawn roadway to the park in the center, and then tapering back up as we meet Broadview to the right. From north to south, using some of the PIC use opportunities along Commissioners to maintain a building height that allows for deep solar penetration into the new local park, and then maintaining height along Lakeshore to the west. Some ideas of massing precedent, and Paul has shared some ideas as well. Tall mid-rise, mews, I think, are incredibly important. I think we've talked about McCleary as a nexus. It's a threshold. It has an incredible matrix of things going on as an intersection in the Portlands. this idea of Portland's as proper, Portland's as a vernacular, the idea of a waterfront application while within McCleary District being withdrawn from the water or removed from the water. How does that impact or impose a language on an architectural solution? So again, to reiterate some of those priority considerations, public realm comfort, sunlight penetration deep into both the parks and the public realm, views to the McCleary stack, concerns regarding overlook to the film studios to the south, optimizing use of public lands, and implementing housing action now. So how do we find that additional density if in fact there's a desire to pursue density? Is it about increasing height along Lakeshore? Perhaps it's height on Don Valley or on the Don roadway. Or alternatively, is it a combination of the two and then exploring additional height opportunities outside what the PLPF framework defines along Broadview, extending what's happening at East Harbor to the north? And I'll close with a couple of other precedent images that show an application of increasing height within that mid-rise tableau. So thank you for your time. And
Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for a pretty comprehensive presentation. So we'll go to questions, and I think Matthew Hickey has already left because I was going to go to him first.
He sent me his questions.
Oh, good. Do you want to ask his question first?
Yep. Thanks for these are Matthew Hickey's questions, not mine. So I haven't read them. So he's asking, of the 28 actions within the city's reconciliation action plan that was shown as a guiding document, which actions are being prioritized for this precinct?
Who wants to take that? Is it clear, the question?
Of the 28 actions within the city's reconciliation action plan, which actions are being prioritized for the precinct?
Probably speak to that.
Take that.
Eric could speak as well. Yeah, sure.
Hi, it's Eric Zarin with the Waterfront Secretariat, City Planning Division. We're currently working with Minokamek and the Indigenous Affairs Office here at the city on sort of a couple of tracks on how we advance reconciliation action in the Portlands. We are currently advancing a sort of a renaming initiative in Villiers Island, as well as a broader Portlands reconciliation action plan. We haven't quite landed on the name yet, but we are bringing sort of a broader vision to bring forward the many different works that are happening along the Portlands, from affordable housing, economic development, placemaking on the Portland's flood protection parks, at the water's edge promenades. So we know there's a lot of different actions going along in this area. And one of our priorities over the next 6 to 12 months is to bring those together into a detailed package that really does highlight what those priorities are for across the Portlands, building on the reconciliation action plan. So while there are 28 actions in the reconciliation action plan, I would say that our priorities right now are around cultural revitalization, the economic development, and housing are probably the top three, and then land stewardship and looking at those opportunities as well in the Portlands. So it's suffice to say that there's a lot of work to be doing and on this file, and we are anticipating bringing some updates on this as well, both Portlands wide, along Villiers Precinct and in McCleary as well. So.
And he had another question, but I think you kind of answered it here. Which Indigenous communities been consulted with or engaged with to support the work presented today? And if yes, who?
So right now we are involved in pre-engagement. We have Minokamek and Laura on board as our consultants to help us advance Indigenous consultation on the precinct plan. And one of our first priorities is to ensure that guiding principle number 5 on ensuring the Indigenous culture knowledges and ways are incorporated into the vision of McCleary. That's one of the things that we have to work on, and we'll be looking forward to bringing back to this group at our next meeting. So, but we are bringing a circle of elders, knowledge keepers, and others together. And that is in process right now, and we expect our first meeting later next month.
Okay, thanks, Fatty. I just have one basic question before we go around the panel here. I just want to be totally clear on this PIC designation. I think I wrote down 25% of the uses, the PIC uses, 5% retail. Obviously, that means 70% could be residential. Is that a correct assumption? And if you have increased height and density, is that percentage ratios stay intact? I'm a little confused because I know there was a big emphasis on not having this as a residential district. Initially.
Short answer, yes, to the first question.
Yeah.
So it's roughly 70%
It is
residential.
okay.
The 5% is not only retail, it's essentially non-res, so you could do more PIC inside that 5. As far as how that prorates up with increased density, I think that's something we will be testing. We're looking for your input on. We've met with the city's economic development team. They'll be providing their take on it as well, and the real estate consultants Tate will also. So that I think is an open
Okay,
question.
just want to be clear.
Yep.
Okay, so let's go around the table. I don't know, Nina Marie, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. I just had 2 simple questions, I think. And one has to do with if you could just clarify the process that you related with respect to the streetscapes and environmental assessments happening. It sounded like you're saying that the environmental assessment would drive the streetscape design, but I think in fact it might be the other way. Could you clarify that?
Yeah, so it is, right now, the opportunity that we have is to do some conceptual designs of those EA streets. But the detailed design will need to be done at a later date when there's further opportunity to study the issues of alignment and the broader network at the same time. But we do have an opportunity right now to look at the local streets in particular and do more detailed design on those. So I guess the 2 processes theoretically will inform each other, but that's also why we've broken the precinct down into 2 phases so that we can allow some additional time for some of that EA work to advance and then tackle some of those questions also as part of our phase 2.
I think I'm asking something even more basic, just trying to understand that there are streets that will run through an area that requires an EA. That's really what you're saying.
Yeah.
And so that has to happen. And what we're trying to do is handle these processes a little bit simultaneously.
Yes.
Okay, thank you just for that clarification. The second question has to do with the view corridors. I certainly understand the orientation that you've shown, but interestingly in that slide that shows the western view out to Keating Channel and the lake, strangely, it prioritizes an incredible view right now along the Keating Channel and doesn't really prioritize the view that you say are the priorities, which is the southern view towards the stacks. And I'm wondering what is the rationale for not prioritizing a view to the west along Keating Channel, which is in fact the orientation of the image you've shown? I don't know what number it is. It's right near the beginning.
Yeah.
I think it's on like maybe 6.
It's actually in
yeah,
the
it's
city's
city's
presentation.
Sorry.
It's in the overall, it's the very first thing you presented,
Yeah, which is in their deck.
but it guides what you've told us, I believe.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to understand the rationale for it. Maybe it's building heights. I don't mean, you tell me.
I'd maybe defer Colin
yeah.
if you could, just because those were
Yeah.
established in the PLPF
Yeah, so
previously.
So those would be part of the urban design basis, right before we're showing that the height strategy of how it's coming down. I'm not sure if you've got access to that.
Yeah, I
Okay,
mean, you can look at that too. That's fine. You're showing the priority views you want, which within the planning framework are the southern facing views.
Right, so the question in terms of how we're looking to the Keating Channel,
Yeah, it just strikes me in the image that you've shown, and that not this one, but the one that is the aerial shot of the construction underway. we just see this incredible sweeping view to the west, and that view along Keating Channel is actually pretty spectacular. I mean, even with
So that is
towards the
also-
Don River and the Keating.
It is a protected view. in
It is a
PLPF
protected
It is.
along
And
the-
It's not shown in this particular context.
It's also I mean, it's the logic behind some of the early PLPF thinking about allocating the height and the density towards that northwest corner to take advantage of that western.
That's the answer I was looking for.
And it's inverse as well from Sugar, this
Sugar
way.
Beach. Yeah, it's helpful, I think, when you're telling the story, especially as you're building out the strategy, to really give the zoom out and then the zoom in, because that is such an incredible view that's a little bit lost in the storytelling here. Thank you.
Brent has another comment.
Yeah, so I just wanted to elaborate on what Paul had said in response to your first question. So EAs don't necessarily have to start from scratch. They can test an idea. This is something that we do often. You set out a vision, you use the environmental assessment process to then confirm and test other things, but often it's about, this is what we would like, and let's go through the process to make sure it can work.
Great, that clarification is helpful.
I just
Good.
have one more
Okay.
piece. And
You got some more?
just on the question of the view corridor, just to answer your question. One piece that's missing, I realize now in this diagram, is that at the northwest corner of Don Roadway and Lakeshore Boulevard, that building there will be the view terminus of the Keating Channel. So there should have been some kind of star or something like that, which is in the PLPF. So that's going to be a special place should there be more setbacks there. That's kind of an ongoing question.
That'd be great to see. Thank you for that.
Okay, Eric, can you go next? Thoughts, questions, any questions?
Question, there was a question just, which is, the street between the stack and the incinerator, is it a street? I just wasn't quite sure in the presentation, what was its characteristic nature? Is it vehicular? Is it just a blended area?
The planning framework does allow for some flexibility there as well. So there is a planned east-west street going across the district, but it does speak specifically to that area where it might pass in front of the commissioners. Could be more of a blended street, more pedestrianized, or changes function to some extent.
So it's still being determined.
Transportation master plan that accompanied the PLPF identified the need for an east-west street that would go from the Don Roadway to the east side of the park between Lakeshore and Commissioners. So it is identified as a need, and I think the EA will sort of
It would need to be
clarify the
30 whether
exact,
it's case enough.
and then obviously it's an active incinerator.
Question.
Okay,
No.
no, okay,
Two more questions.
keep going.
That's okay. 25% pick and 5% retail. Is that in policy now? Is it in the secondary plan?
It's in the secondary plan.
It's in the secondary plan, and that's being settled as part of
That's policy.
Okay. I'm sure you're making a lot of people happy with that. Sorry, that was outside commentary. Last one is along the Don Valley Way. There's a, there's that kind of hydro, the Don Roadway. There's a hydro corridor. There's a hydro thing. Have you started to think about what might be the consideration about how you deal with the interface between the hydro and the development block?
Yeah, so in the fullness of time, the vision is for that hydro corridor to be buried and potentially realigned. So we're sort of planning for that future condition where that's the situation. But I think as part of our explorations through this work, we will also be contemplating that interim period where the hydro corridor might be there and how we can still potentially have some activation or, how it interacts with the early phases of development.
And what's the likelihood of, I see Eric's expression earlier. What was the likelihood of being buried? I'm assuming it comes at a certain cost.
I don't know if the project team has too much more to offer to that, apart from it'll be a journey.
Okay, thank you.
And Eric, there is a portion of the flood there is a setback related to flood protection that also overlaps into that hydro corridor. So we're not going to be bringing buildings hard up against Don Roadway regardless.
Okay.
All right, okay, Eric,
Yes.
Yep. Fanny.
maybe that picks up a little bit on the constraint. There's a diagram of constraints below grade. I just want to understand a little bit, how much is this diagram or this map informing eventual on-grade infrastructure? So is this grid, like, are you trying to conform and reconcile the below-grade constraints of infrastructure with kind of general plan that's happening? Because I felt like there's a little bit of one presentation in which the park and open space and ideas from those precedents that seem to be informing a set of parameters driving the overall precinct plan. And in some other places, I feel like the underground constraints and other existing infrastructure are echoing the plan. So I just want to know, how much is it driving what exists versus how much is your own vision for this area driving what could happen to the infrastructure, especially with the blue ribbon stuff, you know, the water table conversation, the kind of future proofing of lake levels, high water, low water. I just, that dialogue in a very precarious context between below grade, on grade, and your vision overall for precinct plan and road layout. Just maybe a little bit more clarification on how you're thinking about those things.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Fadi. Some of the below-grade infrastructure is existing and will remain. Some of it is proposed as part of the work that's ongoing with the various utilities. So, but it does fall within the street and block framework that's established in the water planning framework. A lot of people preceded us and been working with that in mind. All of the work that's happening both to the north and south is contemplating the same street and block network. So we're not suggesting major adjustments to that spatial arrangement of rights of way is for the most part staying the same in all of our explorations. Now, the blue-green infrastructure idea, the east-west blue ribbon, is happening on a street that doesn't have a lot yet planned for it or existing. So we're at a point where we can inform what's happening there. The groundwater context, the permeability of the soil, obviously we're at a precinct planning level, so we're blue skying a little bit. We'll get more information as we go along, but it is a context we're familiar with and working in Villiers Island as well as along Queens Quay, where that water table is relative to the green infrastructure. So it will inform and perhaps limit some of the GI opportunities, but at this point, it's something we want to have inform the character of the public.
And the placement of the central park is vis-a-vis aligned to the constraints of the infrastructure or your desire for a park vis-a-vis the environmental conditions of the site.
The location of the park we inherited from the planning framework. So that's where it was going to be. So the only option where we're suggesting shifting it to the south is the only one that differs from that. But as we've talked about, there are pros and cons for doing that. But we're happy to hear opinions about that.
Okay, thanks. Let's go online. Bridget, any questions?
Hi there. I do have a few questions. If you could go back to the slide that had built and cultural heritage. I had a question about, I've been on Waterfront for quite some time, and I do remember a presentation on commissioners where there were a series of pylons. So I'd like the one that says built and cultural heritage in the upper left corner. I don't know the actual number of that slide.
Yes, Bridget.
Yeah. But so I do remember a presentation that was focused on commissioners that talked about a series of pylons along commissioners that went from the Hearn along commissioners and then went further north. And that my understanding from this previous presentation was that the pylons, which are those kind of like big kind of hydro pylons, were seen as part of the heritage of this precinct. and I don't see that in your project at all. Is it further west or east, or I'm just trying to understand the where those would be located and whether they appear in this area at all. You know what I'm talking about? These large
I can answer.
pylons that sit in the kind of right of way of commissioners. So you literally drive to the north or the south of a series of these pylons, and they connect the Hearn on the south side. There are lines that cross over the shipping channel, and then they use these pylons, and then it moves further north.
The simple answer is yes, they do extend along the full southern boundary of our site. And so that will be a consideration through the work, although there is parallel work around the streetscape design and future integration of the LRT along commissioners as well. That'll shape some of that work.
But they don't actually, wouldn't you expect that it would show up in this drawing that looks at built and cultural heritage?
So I believe the green cultural heritage landscape line is intended to represent that those pylons.
But I think if you're showing the commissioner stack, the view of the Hearn, I would think that they actually operate at a very human scale that impacts car and pedestrian traffic along commissioners, and that they really should be part of a listed heritage structure, and they should really be visible within a drawing that identifies built and cultural heritage for this neighborhood.
I think, Bridget, they were shown in one of the other images that you had there. Yeah, the aerial, yeah.
But I mean, okay, so my other question was, when you talk about the Broadview extension, it shows as a kind of dotted line across the shipping channel. Is that like a notional line? Is that a future bridge? I just didn't quite understand, and I was hoping for a bit of clarification.
What's that?
It's a future phase. I'm not sure where it fits in the environmental assessment scheme of things, but that's a future phase. I would say a very long-term idea, crossing that ship channel, but that's what's shown in the framework. So future phase, I don't know, Eric, if you have any sense of how that extension, the future Broadview, plugs into environmental assessment, but it's long-term.
Yeah, I mean, the intention is that would be the Broadview, the phase 3, so the phase 1-2 environmental assessment identified this as the preferred alignment for the future extension of the Broadview south of Lakeshore Avenue. So the additional environmental assessment work that needs to be done is a phase 3-4 analysis that would bring Broadview extension over the ship channel. That has been identified as a second connection across the ship channel was identified in the transportation, the 2017 transportation master plan and servicing master plan. The alignment does anticipates the relocation or removal of the hydro substation that exists there, which is a complex project. So the alignment and those discussions are ongoing, and we're part of an OLT settlement process in 2022. The need for that extension isn't identified until the 2040s, so it is a sort of further off project, but the planning work that we're doing right now and the environmental assessment that does have to happen involves sort of working with our partners at Hydro and working with Creatio in the city and others to sort of identify how we advance this project in the future. So,
Thank you. It's obvious it's very long term. Can I just say, I'm watching the time, if we can just go through and expedite our questions and then focus more time on our comments. Is that all?
Yeah, thank you.
Jana? Questions?
Yeah, I do have two quick questions. Thanks, Paul. The first is I noticed that at the base of the residential buildings around the park, McCleary Park, it's all designated as secondary retail. And I'm wondering who decided that, the difference between the primary retail and the secondary retail.
Yeah, so that was coming forward in the PLPF, and I think the intention there with secondary retail is that you protect for that to emerge over time. And whereas there's stronger requirements for primary retail, that's all coming out of the Portland's planning.
Okay. And then my second question is that except for the new east-west street that is introduced across the park and bifurcating it, it doesn't seem like there's anything done on McCleary Park, which I know is phase 2. But I'm wondering if that is indicating something like McCleary Park stays as it is, or McCleary Park gets developed in stage 2, or you don't know. It's just strangely mute in that corner of the site plan. So what's the rationale for that?
So the future for McCleary Park is the location and general program that you see there will remain in terms of a focus programmatically on large sports fields and recreation. Again, we're hearing pretty clearly from our parks partners that those opportunities are far and few between. So the focus on programming is going to be on recreation and will be in that general location. How that is determined by the ultimate alignment of Bouchette is still being determined through the environmental assessment process, but McCleary Park will still have that focus on sports and recreation where it is. There is an opportunity pulling south in and around 400 commissioners. The framework calls that a community hub, so there may be an opportunity to extend some of those park-like conditions in and around the 400 commissioner site. Maybe there's opportunity for quick wins in the near term of bringing the public closer to that site. It depends on the operations and what we find out of those explorations. Hopefully that helps.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Shannon. Okay, let's go back to the panel. Pat, any questions? No? Okay, great, thank you. David.
Yeah, just quickly, you talked about an idea about Muse, and I think a kind of finer grained network of pedestrian spaces. And I'm looking at one of your images here. I think it's on page 40, where you talk about privately owned public space, and there's a color kind of going through the middle of the slide. Could you just describe where those are those spaces meant to reside in that area of the plan? Or are these is this kind of fine grained network not yet established in terms of how it's going to interact, presumably or interface with the public streets?
Sure. I mean, I think that it's a combination, David, between myself and Duncan, because some of this will be informed by what actually happens from a built form and land use perspective on each of the blocks to define what the opportunities are. And certainly how parking is addressed, where we don't bring everything up into the podium, or if we're not using all of it for a pit-core studio type use. They're different responses that could help with extend the public realm. We're not quite there yet.
Okay, Betsy.
Yeah, 2 questions. The first, could you describe the logic behind the retail location in the southwest corner of the site near the film studios and the FedEx, which are all walled off ecosystems? Basically, they provide all of their commerce internally into those sites, as opposed to something supporting the neighborhood more central, or even being opposite the PLFP parks, which would get a huge amount of traffic off the park attendees.
So I think, Betsy, we're sharing an image here which does differentiate itself from what the PLPF describes. And I think the PLPF describes the iteration, I think, that you've described, where the planning framework currently emphasizes primary retail along Commissioners and along Broadview. And we are suggesting that perhaps it's a different way of thinking. Now, granted, we are still showing a retail emphasis down the full extent of Broadview, but rather than relying on Commissioners, which we are not at all, or certainly are proposing not at all, we are suggesting we pull it in to a perimeter condition around that park for the very reasons you just highlighted, as a way to animate and highlight that public. So this is one lever where we are proposing to move away from what the PLPF prescribes.
So the answer is you're maintaining retail on Broadview, but bringing some internal to the block.
Correct, yeah.
And the second question is, the incorporation of the PIC uses is potentially really interesting in terms of how it shapes the building form. And you talk about this being a unique district, but it's just, it's end up looking, it's like big podium towers again. So what makes this district unique?
I think that's why we're here. The big podium towers are really just the starting point from what was in the PLPF built form guidelines around podium heights, towers, 40-meter tower separation. So like all of that's already baked into the PLPF. There is some provision around larger floor plates beyond the 750, which we'll be exploring. And then beyond that, I think that's what we're going to be here for 2 more DRPs, and we're just getting started. So absolutely.
Would be really interesting if we had King East and King West built form here, but we don't. We'd have to build it.
So maybe another way to phrase that is, what's the big idea?
Big idea. It's a good question, Paul.
I think we can come back to that in comments. So I got to get through the questions. So Kevin, sorry.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Any consideration either in the planning framework or through the design team for district energy systems? A net zero energy, zero carbon mandate for the district has been stated, which is fantastic and great. But any consideration for that?
Yes, there's an RFP currently out for a sustainability consultant that will be joining the team. So all of that baked into it.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think that's all the questions. So let's move to comments. We're 2:30, so we're supposedly a little behind, but I'm sure we'll accomplish. So who wants to start? Fatty?
Matthew just.
Matthew, oh, I'm sorry. He has comments ready. Okay.
Just, they're
Great.
very brief.
Please.
He says, green space should be prioritized on the ground plane and should be thoroughly interconnected through the blocks, allowing non-motor vehicle traffic to move efficiently through the precinct at a granular level. Number 2, he says, priority should be given to restoring the natural history and natural heritage over the industrial heritage, so that all our relations, quote unquote, could live here once again. So these were Matthew's comments. I can continue on mine if you want to. So I think they pick up on some of these ideas as well. And I really appreciate the presentation. I think, again, we're kind of very lucky to be able to have these amazing waterfront, massive precincts and districts be designed from scratch on our waterfront. So I think all these comments are coming from a place of wanting to see something very special and unique come in here. So curious to me that the 4 options are explorations that seem to constantly like hinge on this north, south, east, west grid from the PLFP as the placement and driving force of where these parks and road systems go. So I would imagine that if this was to be updated today, I think some new parameters would take focus. Primarily the emphasis and the relationship of blue-green infrastructure to public spaces and parks and open systems as a driving force for a block plan. So I would urge the team to please look at, consider the topographic elevation, soil permeability, water flow as being not just in relation to subsurface conditions, but what could be happening at the surface, and giving it priority just as much as we're giving priority to view and sunlight, is thinking about the water table and the relationship of the ground and water flow through the public realm as being just as important and just as prioritized. And many of the precedents that you've shown that I really, really admire, including many of the amazing new post-industrial waterfront projects around the world, have actually worked to dissolve some of this grid in favor of a public realm and an open space system that is responsive to the water around it. And I guess, the Villiers Island project and all the amazing stuff happening just west of here is actually taking some of these ideas as well. So this is a very different context, and I'm just wondering if there are ways to kind of take some of the lessons learned from these ideas and begin to enforce them here, so it doesn't just begin to start out with a very typical grid that then orients buildings and then the open space is carved out of the remaining block pattern, but instead the open spaces and the public realm are responsive to environmental conditions that are necessary for this area to adapt, especially it being a precarious position near the water. So I just want to emphasize again the importance of thinking about the sequence of public and private open spaces as being connected. From some, some of the amazing examples you showed that are more from used, semi-private, to private, to large open spaces, eventually linking up to the amazing new parks and open spaces that are being designed all around. So I would kind of put that as the main frame and then work my way down to the building block as a kind of driving force for a new block pattern on the site.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks, Matthew, even though he can't hear us, I want you to formally thank for those comments. Nina Marie.
Thank you. I'll quickly build on those. These are also, thank you very much for the presentation. I understand that you are beginning in the context of the PLFP, but I will say that in the spirit of the precinct plan and really helping this to evolve, we can honor the PLFP this some time ago now, but we can also necessarily evolve it strategically. And I think that's really what you're trying to do. And I want to encourage that in a couple of really clear ways. The first is to actually, I think, go back to the Indigenous context that you offer and then swiftly deviate from in some very specific ways. And by that, I mean, you really talked about the Indigenous history being a connection to the river, the wetlands that were there, and really this being about confluence and connectivity. And I think those are really critical watchwords that I do see you doing in some of this project, but I think could be more. Remembering that this is the terminus of a 365 square kilometer watershed, the most urbanized watershed, arguably in North America. And why is it terminating in a grid with podium buildings? When it could be really focused around the green infrastructure that I know you are trying to highlight. And I think there are ways to push that further. One of the ways to do that is to look back to your principles, one of which was biophilic design. And if you really unpack what that means, it centers the principle of not land use, but land relations. You're relating to land and water in a really strategic and topographic way that has absolutely design centrability. And this means by walking, by following the sun, by following the areas of thermal comfort, not letting what is below grade completely dictate what's above grade in the way that Fadi had suggested, but that really emphasizing confluence and connectivity through thermal comfort. How does it feel to be in these spaces? Not because they're shaped by the grid, but rather by connectivity from lake to riverbed to the new parks that are all around you. They give you that context so that when you talk about expanding the park, for example, if that's the center of this project in phase one in particular, you can really exhale into the street. You can let that park breathe itself into the streets very physically. The examples that you've shown, and I'm thinking, having been there many times, but Löfvingsgatan in Stockholm or Malmö in the Västra, these are areas that have a right to shade. It's not just about sunshine anymore, but we're looking at a climate resilient time when we have a right to shade. And that means canopy, not building shade, right? Canopy diversity, things that you can do to allow that streetscape to emulate that connectivity. Even if it's focused around a grid, it can bust out. It can be curvilinear on the surface at times. So those are all ways I think you can really do this by emphasizing connectivity, confluence, and biophilic design. Those are principles at this stage that are totally relevant, right? They don't just disappear and then we focus on the built form, but really focusing on that green infrastructure, I think will help to make that happen. And finally, the last thing is your engagement strategy can drive this, right? Instead of separating, and you used a strange way of framing water and or nature as though they're somehow not the same thing. Water and nature and biodiversity and parks, they're the same thing. Focus on biophilic design, ask people to think about them holistically, and you will avoid this problem of, slice, dice, separate, and we have to make trade-offs between these things that are actually vital to us in a climate resilient future. The only way to be there is to be connected. So thank you for offering this as a starting point.
Thank you very much. Eric?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. I've got some, they're not in necessarily any particular order, but I think that, yes, the public realm driving the some of these other solution, I think is something that's interesting. I think that that Central Park, looking at how to expand it, I think it's something that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that in addition to look at that, I think looking at these, you use the analogy of the necklace and pearl at some point, that there are some, I think, other places to start to think about where you can introduce some of these pops, some of these things. I think that especially when you look at the street on the periphery, I think Broadview is going to become for a long time kind of determination of these things. I think like thinking of it as a very special place is actually quite critical in terms of, because it's also looking at the first part of the presentation, it's going to be 35 meters. So it is the width of Spadina, something that is quite critical. It's not small. Activating this with retail and all that is really difficult. It's really sensitive. So I'm glad you have someone like that you have a retail consultant on in there, and Jamie. So looking at the correct character of that street, to me, it's going to be interesting how you open up these corner. I think similarly is, and this is in their next iteration, understanding the public realm character of commissioner of Dawn Ways, because if the towers don't go for a long time, I mean, you've got a really extended right of way there, and I think there's something really particular and interesting to look at in terms of creating a place there that is, you know, that it will become that doorway to the river. And same thing with Lakeshore. Lakeshore is going to be something that is, you know, has a higher traffic. What is the character? So I think understanding the periphery and the interior of what these might be. There is just on the notion of street, I really hope when the EA is in progress that the streets between the stack and the incinerator, I think, is gone, or is very much like an emergency things, and is actually more of a thinking of an expansion of the public realm of the park. I think linking that heritage within that green space, I think, is something that that really needs to be taken into consideration. There is a major challenge. I mean, 30% non-res is very challenging these days. Post-pandemic, how you organize that is something that is going to be challenging. Starting with the retail, I think from a retail strategy, I think I'm always a fan of focus it as much as possible. Actually, I'm not sure you would want to have it around the entire parks in the center. Just thinking that you probably want to focus it. I like the idea of having a first stretch, a first block that is maybe more tight, more Main Street, that it just kind of leads to something. I think and then the nature of what's going to be on Broadway, I think might be the kind of the bigger thing potentially, or something I think it's just something to continue to look at. If the park in the center gets expanded on one side or the other through the closure of a potential one of these links, I think there's then a very nice opportunity to introduce that notion of a community amenities that is directly connected to a park, so that, which would probably, I'm assuming, would fit in that grade level, whether it's retail or it's part of your picks or whatever. So I think that I think gonna be something that combines that. There is a question in, you know, is looking at your floor plate, and because they're very wide in many places, so they're not residential floor plate for the podiums. And, you know, thinking about where the pick uses, you know, it's a question of how we organize this. Is it that maybe these pick uses are more on the periphery and it's residential more in the inside? Like Lakeshore is a harsh road. Is it something that maybe if we look, yeah, I like that sketch actually that has the big giant circle, because it's basically the amount of land area you have is the amount of pick generally. So is it a question of then there's a bit of a donut like along Commissioner, along Lakeshore, along Broadview, and maybe along the park that is where those pick and are concentrated, versus the center is more of a neighborhood? I mean, that's something maybe to see, because I suspect you're going to have to, because developers are going to come with different ideas, so they're going to want to choose various solutions depending on what the market is going to be able to absorb. So, and then the last week was just in terms of, you know, like that notion of creating as much of a pedestrian district. I think that's one of the intentions. So as you look for your servicing strategies, parking access strategies, and given that all your blocks have a peripheral access of some sort, that, looking at to try to keep those as much as possible, either at the periphery or very close to where those main accesses. So in a way to pacify the interior of the block. The last thing, this is a big debate at the city in terms of, Nina Marie mentioned that, is like shades versus sun versus, and I think that there needs to be some give and take there. I think I was in Montreal last week and just experiencing some of those new development, which are tight. And, and then I think the question is then, I don't think because I look at some of your diagram, I think it's on around page 70 or so, that looks, or 70, about, do you sculpt the building to let light everywhere? To me, it's like, you pick the moment where that light needs to be. Not every stretch of street needs to be a 80% of the right of way with step back with this, especially if you're on top of that, putting constraint on having 30% non-res. I think that, there is, and it's giving that you also have these really great view corridor as you look in and out the site. So it's not like, there's not long stretch that you wouldn't have access to light. So I think this is a place maybe where that can be explored, that some of the street can be tighter, because you have a lot of density to put there. And my final comments was on giving that broad views is 35 meters right away. I don't think it needs to be correct. I think it could be a bit more robust from a density perspective. This is one of the places maybe you can carry more, because frankly, it's not going to. I think you're going to need it to be able to create and frame that view, frame that perimeter, to create a sense of place.
Great, thank you. Fatty? Okay, great. Bridget, I want to make, because they have to leave.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the presentation. One of the hallmarks of Waterfront Toronto is leading with landscape. So I guess I feel the park system that you were showing as a sketch, where there was a kind of green boulevard, Central Park, other boulevard, and then McCleary Park, for me, is actually really important, because it actually becomes not just a park system, but really the identity of this area. You have a challenge because Lakeshore is very wide and super busy. Commissioners is also super wide as a kind of road right of way with the boulevard in the middle. And so you really need a much more intimate system that is actually very much neighborhood focused to be parallel. And so I feel like for me, that's a kind of, it's not just a nice thing to do, but actually really will be the key identity for this neighborhood. And when we think about Corktown Common or Sherbourne Commons, these are actually, the kind of anchors for the whole neighborhood around it. And I would imagine that this could be an equal anchor that might actually be built before some of the development blocks. I really like the idea of developing a new typology. Maybe there's a rule that there is no underground parking because of the kind of specifics of this soil condition, where you're really, this was all a swamp that was filled in to create a whole industrial area close to the downtown. And I think that to not go underground is actually a good thing. To use the center of a very deep block and to use it maybe for parking in the interim, but to also contemplate future proofing of it and other uses that can happen in the middle when we no longer need parking is a really important exercise in developing these new typologies. And I feel like it needs to be tested. So you can accommodate X number of parking spaces, but when we actually don't need those parking spaces, what happens in the middle of the block and how could it be utilized in really interesting ways? Also right now, Lakeshore is a tough street. It's super wide, really busy. Right now, the only crossing is at Carlaw and Lakeshore, where there's a gas station, a car wash, pretty darn suburban. And then the kind of question for me is linking, how you imagine linking at Logan, Bouchette, these other places to connect to neighborhoods on the north side of Lakeshore. Areas like around Logan and Lakeshore are pretty actually interesting and quite vital neighborhoods. And they become, in effect, the neighborhood context for places like McCleary Park, and prevent it from just being like the kind of baseball diamond for everyone in the city. It actually needs to have a neighborhood character. And unless you create the north-south connections to north of Lakeshore, it's going to be really hard for it to have its a character and identity till the blocks are built out. But I feel like it's a really exciting and important area of the city. Moving east from Villiers and connecting to existing neighborhoods is so essential. And I think all of the effort and the early stages, I feel like you're pretty far along in your thinking. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Jana?
Thanks, Paul, and thank you for a really interesting presentation. I want to pick up on what Bridget was saying, and also earlier, Claudia and Nina Marie. I know we're short on time, so I'll try and keep this very brief. I just want to talk specifically about the parks and the edges of the park. And right now, I think there's a kind of tension between what your goals are, what you say your goals are for the park, and the way in which they're drawn. Right now, they're simply the buildings are like containers or edges, bookending all the edges of the park in a way that makes it hard for me to understand what your vision is. And I think if we thought about this as more landscape led, and you thought about a way in which to describe the landscape of this place in a different way, I think that it would actually go a long way in validating what your vision is, because I'm struggling actually to understand what the material and environmental vision of this precinct is in the way you're talking about it and the way it's drawn. I feel like there's a real tension there, and you're holding back from letting us in on what it is you think the transformation is going to be. So my question about McCleary Park earlier was really basically to say, it may be in phase 2, it may stay in some ways like it is, but it informs the experience of that precinct. It's all, if it's not 25%, it's 20% of that precinct, and it has an incredibly important job to play and role to play, not only environmentally, but experientially as a neighborhood place to gather. So I think I would really like to see a way in which you could come back with an like an exploration. That word was used a lot, but I don't actually see it. I see lines on a rectangle, but I don't see material and kind of spatial exploration that I think would really help push this along from something that's a very blunt kind of plan. And I think if I listen to what you say, that really seems to be your goals. And even if you start with those explorations and map them out and really identify what are, say, the top 3. Finally, I agree with Eric that I really feel like that east-west street shouldn't continue through the park. I think that's got to be a different kind of condition there. And I don't think it would be a bad idea to have it either go north or south, but not through the park. And I think the last thing is I still am struggling with, there seems to be an underlying narrative here about what the PLPF gave you in terms of a plan and what you've done. And I would actually like to see a stronger summary, like tie the bow around what you got and what now you think is important to push forward, and the critical areas that you want to depart from and the reasons why. I think my hunch is they're all really valid things that you're picking up on. Maybe it's the gap in time from when that was done to now, whatever. But I would like to see it actually very succinctly stated so that we can understand, again, what your vision is, because you seem very excited about it. It's a great part of the city, and it'll be a huge contribution. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jana. David?
Yeah, just a few comments. I'll try to make it quick. And I want to talk about 2 parts of the plan. One is the the public realm, specifically the streets, and the second is the kind of the private / public realm within the blocks. And I just wanted to put this out there. You've been talking about PIC and in some degree the street kind of DNA in terms of the integrating green and blue infrastructure. But I was just thinking about hearing David Crombie speak about kind of the genesis of the Crombie or the St. Lawrence neighborhood. He talked about the importance of the local streets with the front doors and the kitchen windows, looking out onto those streets and really creating that connection between the buildings and what was going on in the streets, that when the children were out there, their mothers could watch them. And I think that kind of granularity needs to be brought to the plan, even in terms of the vision for what the streets are, because that relationship of the building and the street, I think, is really critical. West Donlands, it was an idea about kind of front porch. So there's different ways of thinking about it, I think, but I think that's really critical in terms of the streetscape design and how we'll respond to that in the next meeting. The second, to my point about these mid-block connections, again, thinking about some of the recent work, for example, on Quayside, some of the great work that Sebra's doing at the in the West Donlands now, we were talking about it just a little bit earlier, this kind of network of public spaces that links through the blocks, but not necessarily following the grid. It kind of winds its way through, it connects diagonally, it could connect the park in different ways through these blocks. And I think that network is really critical and should in part drive the built form, as Fadi was talking about, and not be just a response to the PIC program or the parking garage kind of layout of the podium, whatever that might be. So I think that network needs to be sorted out earlier than later, just to build on some of the other comments that were being talked about. For me, thank you.
That's okay. All right, thank you. Pat, comments?
Yeah. I'm going to just focus my comments on built form, and then I'm going to ask Paul a question. Do you remember, like 20 years ago, when work was being done on this, there was an expression for building types that could accommodate residential and film and office, called condenser? Was there something like that?
Yeah, vaguely remember, yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, okay, so when you said, what's the big idea? It reminded me, and it honestly, maybe we could rethink residential. I don't know, this would be a radical opportunity in the city to sort of think about that. But, and then Amelia, when you talked about the King Street buildings, the sort of warehouse type that works so well for almost anything, right? That, maybe the big idea in terms of built form could be, a kind of predominance of these kind of very grid-like buildings that can accommodate multiple uses, so that you sort of blur the distinction between residential and the PIC. I don't know if it's possible. I think it would be interesting, it would be worth a test. And it would give this area kind of an identity that would be none other, I think, in the city. Particularly, that's the sort of programmatic mandate of it. And I think that wouldn't take it away from being 4-story podium buildings. So there's lots of examples. I know the tower and the 4-story podium is, the archetype of City of Toronto. Don't think it really is the best. So can those freestanding buildings go up to mid-rise heights? Can they be much higher than the 4 stories to accommodate those kinds of uses? And can towers actually be on top of them? I don't see necessarily why a tower always has to be on a 4-story building. And in that way, if you start to think about extruding up those mid-rise types, it's a way of gaining a lot more density, a lot more quickly, way more density that you get from increasing the height of a tower, right? So I would definitely look at that. And then I would say, David, absolutely, that the idea, kind of all the discussion about landscape and the kind of more granular feeling of the neighborhood is absolutely necessary, that parking does not go up and fill those courtyards. I've actually worked on a few projects. Those are kind of beasts, I have to tell you. They're nasty types that get filled with loading and parking, and they're just nasty and pig-like. So I think you want to keep that courtyard space open so that you continue to have that kind of finer grain pedestrian movement through the site. If you can sort of narrow streets and all that, at least it offers a different way of of moving and experiencing the kind of open space on the site.
Great, thanks. Betsy, sorry.
Thank you so much. Just a comment on one of past comments is like thinking about a parking structure similar to the Herzog Demeron project in Miami is fantastic and may actually free up some of your other buildings for other things. You have one of the best sites and one of the hardest sites in the city, the best site really being the end of Keating Channel. I can't imagine that the final solution will be an extension of those towers on top of that podium, but something that takes full advantage of the view, full advantage of an area that should be very dense. It's the corner of a very active park and a huge employment lands just north of there. You've got the opportunity for, it is like the retail beginning of your site, really, that corner, and a spot that could support a lot of public programming. So you've got a lot of public institutions to fit into the site. That really, for me, is the start of the big idea of your project. Supported then, I'm going to strongly suggest that the thinking around limiting the street around the park be extended to a retail area. I think it's been said a couple of times. I'm going to say it again. Having a pedestrian street, a pedestrianized retail space, maybe combined with the landscape idea and the pops. If you, similar to how busy the distillery district is, you're going to have so many more people here. It will be supported without any problem. And that, I think, is something that you should look at along with your landscape partner for sure. The third piece is talking about the muse is probably the example that we're all gravitating towards. The language of a muse is very different from the language of the building form that we're seeing in your slides. So ensuring that if you want a fine-grained plan, it has to be able to withstand the development phase that's coming after your work is done. That is, I'm incredibly interested to see how you approach that. It's difficult. It's something that at the panel we talk about constantly and something that we rarely see. And if you can figure that out, you're unlocking something in the city that I think is going to be really important moving into, say, the next 20 years of development. So the hardest part of your site is the southeast corner. The convergence of Broadview and Bouchette is you're pointing a huge urban arrow at the FedEx and two large film studio plots, which we know are all chain linked off. So it's, I mean, I'm interested in a unique solution to that parcel. I don't know if it's just the end of Broadview sliced off like a sausage. I think it might be something, whether it's a big building, whether it's a void. I mean, you're going to have to test a number of different things. And I'm very much looking forward to the development of that site as well. There's so much potential on this parcel. And I think that the panel is telling you that we're supportive of deviating from the plan that you started with in order to support a really unique development to create a new and unique neighborhood. And thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, Betsy. Kevin.
Thank you. I think actually there's a strong methodology that's kind of based on a sort of curiosity, but highly respectful from that initial planning framework. And I think that's understandable. I think the panel is just generally eager to see how flexible and how resilient that grid can be under that kind of framework of methodology analysis. I've learned quite a bit from your presentation. I would ask you to, as you explore density on the site, changes to the density or where that density is located. I have a mandate to sort of look at carbon intensities. I think you have to also map on the site how you're going to generate renewable energy. So as you're looking at densities, how are you going to generate solar power that to make this en masse? So I just think that should be another layer of analysis as you look at some of these very interesting and important maybe variances from the framework.
Okay, thank you. Great. I think that covers everybody. So I'm doing my best. We're a little behind time to summarize. I hope this has been helpful to you. And somebody said, the sort of theme of Waterfront Toronto has always been lead with landscape. And you've heard that in many different ways being expressed here today. And what struck me is when you started your presentation, one of your slides said, this is a unique area. And what we're saying, why? How are you going to make it really unique? Because the formula seems to be more of the same. And so you've heard some very strong ideas about big ideas. And I think the first one, frankly, is to prioritize green space, restore the natural heritage instead of the industrial heritage to make it unique. And you've heard comments about where, this is where the Don watershed will empty out into Lake Ontario. What a special opportunity for a unique experience as opposed to another building on a podium. So I think that's really, really powerful as a big idea. Sub-themes of that focus on the blue-green water flow throughout the public realm. Look at dissolving the typical grid pattern of streets. Start with, basically what we're saying is, fundamentals of planning usually are streets, blocks, and open space. We're saying open space, blocks, streets is, I think, the essence of the message here. And that will make it different and unique. Start with the open spaces, look at the connections, both public and private. The focus of the district should be the relationship of land and water. All of those sub-themes, I think, are wrapped up in that big idea. Principles of connectivity and confluence throughout is part of that. And related to all of those comments, I think your expand plus green network drawing was, yeah, it's kind of interesting, but we need more detail. Really, really, more thinking about what do you have in mind here, as opposed to just a green spine. So some of the suggestions that have been made, I think, that we all agree with is to rethink the need for the street between the Don River and the Stack, and devote it to the public realm and pedestrians, and make that, a really powerful connection throughout this entire precinct. Other suggestions in terms of built form, explore maybe a different big idea for the built form. And you've heard those comments about, what kind of buildings, what typology of buildings would allow for the flexibility and suitability of all uses. One of the things that I was concerned about, that's why I asked the question, 70% residential, the market will dominate. I'm under no illusions that if it's 70% residential, you'll probably get mostly a residential district with a little bit of retail and some pick uses thrown in for good measure. And I don't think that's what you want. So I think that's more thinking about, is that different typology of building, one that frankly hasn't been utilized in other new districts. But the reference was made to King Spadina for historical reasons, because those buildings have gone back and forth for all kinds of different uses. We all know that. So I think that's an important big idea for built form. And some commentary made about retail. Broadview, I love the analogy. I didn't quite realize 35-meter right away, same as Spadina. Really, probably if you can take a lot more density on a street that wide, and the whole importance of focusing retail in a more concentrated area instead of bits and pieces all over the place. So there's obviously you're going to have a retail consultant and retail strategy, but we need more detail on that. In terms of parking, always a problem, especially in the Portlands for the water table reasons. The Vancouver model we're all familiar with parking's above grade and it's in the middle and surrounded by a podium of uses, etc. That's one option. I don't know if it's better or worse, but the flexibility of if you go that route, what happens if you don't need the parking after? What can those spaces be utilized for? Or maybe you don't need very much parking at all, period. And that would make it really unique, right?
People won't be able to drive in the area anyway.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
It's just going to be sitting there.
There you go. Okay. So, I mean, basically what we're saying here is don't be shy and we want you to explore and spell out where and why you would love to depart from the initial ideas. And that's what we're saying. And I think we're giving you license for what it's worth to do that. And I think it's really, really important because otherwise it's going to be, I have this awful feeling of, I remember going way, way back at the early days of this panel when we're looking at the West Don lands and laying out Front Street. I remember how wide it is. And I remember old George Baird saying, you know, it's too wide. You're going to regret it, whatever. You know, lessons learned, right? So lots of things to think about in greater detail. And now's the time, as opposed to when you get further down the road. And I think if that analysis is thorough and it's good, I don't foresee any problems in changing that initial framework. And a final couple of comments about obviously more work on energy analysis. I remember Jack Layton telling me when I was in the old council working with him about, you know, I had this vision in the Portlands of all this development happening with you know, zero carbon, you know, totally different energy sources, et cetera. Like this is 30 plus years ago, right? Well, we're here now, right? So I think now's the opportunity to be bold. Don't be afraid to rethink. And we look forward to this coming back because we'll have a lot more to say. So I hope that's a reasonable summary. So we give you an opportunity to respond. There's no vote because it's just issues ID. Anybody want to respond to what I've said or the panel members have said? Are you all in shock?
I think, thank you. I mean, it's all points well taken, and thank you for the license. We'll see where we can go with that.
We'll see if we have the credibility for you to cash the.
Well, you fired the starting gun and we're ready.
No. I mean, now's the time. That's what we're saying.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah. Okay, let's get underway. It's 25 after. We're a little behind. Basin Media Hub detailed design. Chris, City of Toronto is going to do the introduction. Are you ready?
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
All right. Hello, everyone. Be very brief in just introducing this project because it's appeared at a panel twice before. But I think it's kind of an exciting pairing with the precinct planning level work that preceded it, sort of high level precinct planning work. And now we're at the detailed design of a core use that's sort of at the end of the site plan process. So I'm excited to be back for the third round. Leon will also introduce a bit of the consensus comments from the last time and the DRP process. Next slide, please. So just to introduce the site to you all, this should be familiar, but it's a large site at the corner of the Turning Basin and the shipping channel within Portlands, just south of Commissioner Street, so just south of the McCleary precinct that you were just considering. In terms of surrounding land uses to the south, you have the decommissioned Hearn generating station, the operating Portlands Energy Center, the Basin Transformer Station just to the west. Neighbors to the north include the FedEx warehouse there, as well as a large pile of 2-inch gravel. So very much an industrial context at the moment, but also a place that is evolving. Next slide, please. Again, just in terms of neighbors, again, Pinewood Studios to the west, and then further west, of course, the Portlands Flood Protection Project. Next slide, please. In terms of the progress today, that transformation of the Portlands is very much underway. We have the waters of Lake Ontario flowing into the new Don River. Next slide. And I really like this view because it shows both the existing Don River waiting patiently at the Keating Channel to flow into that new river, but also in the background, you get a sense of just how close the film studio uses within the Portlands are going to be to the downtown, to all this amazing new open space. So really kind of a short bike ride over the newly opened Commissioner Street Bridge would get you to this office in about 10 minutes. So very much going to be connected to the broader revitalization of the waterfront while currently kind of a scrappy industrial place. So this project kind of mediates between those things, and we'll talk about that. So the overall Portlands planning framework for this district, so it is employment focused, focused on growing Toronto's screen-based industries, especially interactive digital media, things we would call pick core uses, which you just discussed. And then the planning framework also provides very detailed design direction on built form, movement, access, transportation, demand management, sustainability, biodiversity, cultural heritage, public art. Again, the zoning supports that vision and direction with basic built form standards for height and density. And then there is a zoned 18-meter band along the ship channel, which is zoned for Water's Edge Promenade. That is a separate scope of work. And maybe I'll just jump to the next slide. So, but I would like to just quickly update the panel on kind of parallel planning processes because I think they are important. So that ship channel promenade is subject to a separate design process led by CreateTO along with city divisions. And the design of that promenade is going to be informed by ongoing Indigenous engagement in Portlands, including recent Indigenous engagement done through the PIC Core Urban Design Guideline process. It also has to be shaped by operational and jurisdictional considerations for the working port. But the intention there is for the design to integrate substantial planting, seating, public art areas, space for pedestrians, cyclists. It is on an implementation timeline to be funded in the 2023 to 2032 capital budget. And then in terms of the build out of that promenade, that is still being confirmed. Just setting that up for this group because the focus today really is on the studio site plan. And of course, there's that relationship to the promenade, but the promenade itself is something that is coming through a separate process. This panel will also be familiar with the PIC Core Urban Design Guidelines. The city has taken really the feedback of the panel to heart and implemented an Indigenous engagement process that's connected both to those design guidelines and then other ongoing work from the Portlands. And so the design guidelines themselves, are not coming back to you today. They will at a later date, but that work is being completed in coordination with McCleary work. And so we will report back to the DRP at the right time. But just to say that we are planning and doing at the same time in this part of the Portlands. And you'll see that this site implements some of the directions from that policy work, and then we are continuing to evolve. So next slide, please. Again, just for some background on the site, it is both public and private land, hence returning to the public lands third review at the WDRP. Since the last appearance at WDRP, there have been two site plan submissions to the city, and staff have been working closely with the applicant on refining those. So we're pretty close to the end of the site plan review process and here to look at kind of the fine detailing that has happened through that work. And then also just to note that the previously listed Heritage Sun Oil building has now been designated by council. So that's that building in the image here, and you'll see how it's adaptively reused through this project. That's it for me, and I'll turn it over to Leon just to finish off.
Thank you, Chris. So as Chris mentioned, this project has been to the panel twice already. The first time for Issues ID in June of 2022. And they came back last year in January for schematic design. And at that time, the project received a vote of full support from the panel. And today, this will be the detailed design stage of the review. And unless, the project receives a vote of non-support or if there's, substantial changes later on, this will likely be the last time that we will see it. And to recap, the panel offered overall support, for the overall proposal last time. And just highlighting a few key comments, the terminus of Carlisle Avenue should be improved. Some suggestions included, offsetting the building footprint, creating a taller built form, trying to frame the view to the water, or, marking the moment with something special with regards to landscape, appreciating the work done for the Water's Edge Promenade. There's room to improve that. Moving the waterfront gate further in to maximize the potential for hosting events, shifting the line of trees and vegetation away from the buildings to amplify the microclimate conditions, provide shade, also maximizing opportunities for understory landscaping to increase the ecological footprint along that edge. And also think about how public art can be integrated. Some of these questions will be addressed today, but as Chris said, the web is not part of the design scope. So we'll track these comments And, whenever that scope begins to advance, we will try to address those. And for sustainability, appreciating the stormwater management strategy, but also consider opportunities for on-site renewable energy generation, such as solar panels, photovoltaics. So for today, we would like to ask the panel to think about overall studio campus interface with the public realm, the detailed design of the POPs at the various studio gates and the landscape design changes. Basin Street, does it balance production-friendly employment environment with Portland's complete streets objectives? And then on the buildings, you'll be seeing updated material palette and facade strategy. So look for your feedback on the key elevations, especially the southern elevations along the Water's Edge Promenade, in terms of the design excellence at these moments, considering both the cost pressures and that these are specialized light industrial buildings, and of course opportunities for further articulation on these facades and creating visual interest, especially with using concrete with these enclosures. So that's the end of our introduction, and I would like to introduce. Yes, sure.
I forgot to mention Julie Bogdanovich is also here from Urban Design to help answer questions along with myself. So my apologies, Julie.
Great. And now I think.
Yeah, Leon, hi, this is Carol with Hackman. I just wanted to click back a couple slides on your slides to the timeline. We have actually done our site plan application resubmission. So we've done 2 rounds and we have draft NOAC in place. I'm not sure we gave you an accurate update on where we are with site plan, so.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that, yep.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, I think we can start the design presentation, and I would like to introduce, I think, Brian will kick off the presentation. Brian Glodney is the Executive Vice President of Hackman Capital Partners. And Brian, if you don't mind, please introduce the rest of the team that are with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Leon and Chris, for the introduction, and a real pleasure to be here with everybody today. Even though we're here virtually, we have a handful of our team members there in person with you as well. We're always appreciative of the time and the effort put into these types of meetings. They've been tremendous dialogues with the team here over the last year plus of this process. And it's been a while since we've been with you, and I know we have some new team members as part of the review panel with us. So we'll spend a bit of time at a high level giving some introduction remarks in terms of how the project's been framed and the approach, and then allow our team to dive into some of those specific details that Leon outlined. But by way of background, James, you can go to the next one, please. Hackman Capital Partners, we're the largest independent owner and operator of studios. Our footprint takes us across the US and Canada and into the UK, where we have projects under development, including Ireland and Scotland. We also have an operational team, the MBS team, which has a global footprint that helps us operate in stages beyond our own studios that we own and develop ourselves, but serving media and production content creators across the globe. And so we have a very lively and active connection to the pulse of the entertainment industry, what those demands look like today to meet those needs of those individuals producing in this current environment, but also looking out into forecasting what the trends are in the industry, how the buildings and the facilities, how the infrastructure and all of that might need to adapt with all of these amazing ways in which the content industry is changing. Just like technology rapidly changes at this infinite pace, the media industry is right there alongside of it. And so with that, urban infill studios for us, this is not a new or a first time process. James, if you go to the next one, please. This is something that we have done throughout our portfolio. We've been incredibly excited to be here in Toronto. We've been pursuing this project since about 2020. So it's been a number of years for us in this pathway. So we're really exciting that, as Carol outlined, we're getting one step closer every day to bringing this project to fruition. It's been a wonderful experience working with the city here, and we're really proud of this project to bring this first purpose-built studio to the Portlands in the heart. It was interesting to hear kind of that back end of that conversation of the previous project, just to see how, ultimately these visions of future growth and development in the city will all start to come together and really, foster this unique place, this active, vibrant place with this robust economy and creative industry behind it. And so this is, at the end of the day, about supporting the entertainment industry in Toronto. It's about creating high quality, well-paying jobs for those that live there. And it's about ensuring that any of the productions that are in Toronto stay in Toronto, and that even more so, it can become a magnet for productions to want to produce, particularly at this site and with our neighboring site next to us. There's a lot of synergy there already. Our studios, most people think of studios as industrial boxes or sheds with bland materials that kind of turn their back to the street. We really like to celebrate these studio buildings and have our active uses where they are active. The production offices in particular face out and help activate our edges. We like to make sure that we have gates that celebrate the studio mystique. Everybody loves setting foot through the studio gates and setting foot onto the back lot where the magic happens. And so making sure that that feels like a real elevated human pedestrian experience that is integrating with the public realm around us. And then lastly, Toronto and all of its green code standards has been pushing us from an operator standpoint. And it's something, in fact, that we've actually been carrying over to some of our other studio projects relative to the green strategies and the infrastructure that we're bringing to the project. And so all of this is to say, we're really excited to be delivering the Portland, a component of the Portland's vision, where this is a fantastic opportunity to be on the waterfront from a branding perspective, and also gives us a really unique opportunity to again, revitalize land with a heritage building at the front door. So that's always this exciting component. I've got a long portfolio of working with heritage buildings. We've been selected because of that track record to be the stewards of properties like this. So this will be a wonderful feather to carry on with that. And then the other two components here, as I mentioned, the green standards, you'll see throughout the project, but then also we're going to focus today on the public edge and those pops. And then finally here, I just want to say that we have this really, really great team. We have this team that we've worked with locally here in Los Angeles, where we're based. But more than that, and you can see a large percentage of our team is based in Toronto. Again, some are sitting in the room with you today. And what's important here is we've got this amazing blend of creative, strategic thinking, but also technical thinking. These are industrial factories of content production. So it's not just about the way it looks, but it's about operational efficiency and opportunity to really kind of meet the needs of the industry that's out there. And so James and Ifan will walk through the project in terms of the delivery, but it's a high quality project in our eyes. It's a compatible environment with the public realm. It's really built around operational efficiency and flexibility. And at the end of the day, and here we are a year later, this is about finding an implementable project. This is a project that we want to break ground on and we want to deliver to the market. And we're really excited about what we have to share with you today. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to James, but Carol, myself, and the team will all be around for questions after.
Thanks, Brian. I'm James Dewald. I'm the design architect at SOM for the Portland's studio project here that we're going to be reviewing today. Hopefully, you'll see some things that are really about making this project a reality, as Brian mentioned, and you'll see that a lot of the aspects that were positively received in the previous reviews, in particular the project's urban relationships, are still very much part of the design. So you all know very much where we are, especially given the two prior presentations today, the intersection of the ship channel and the turning basin being the kind of geographic markers for the Basin Studios project. We have a largely industrial context today, and we're excited for the transformation that's represented in the McCleary district and Villiers Island, and how Basin Studios can augment those as an employment center within the Portlands. Our site today is relatively underutilized. It does include that heritage Sun Oil building, which is now under designation, and two important waterfront edges along the ship channel and the turning basin, which are currently undergoing improvements through Create TO. And we're really excited about the transformation of the city and this portion of the Portlands, which really represents a new chapter for Toronto, right against the waterfront at the mouth of the Don River and adjacent to downtown. In terms of planning considerations, our project sits within the production, interactive, and creative core, for which there are draft guidelines and within the Portland's planning framework. Both of these documents served as or reference points for us as a design team to develop a project which, while industrial in use, was very responsive to these urban frameworks and the possibility of creating a production environment that could be a good neighbor to this future mixed-use district. Some of the challenges that we have with production environments are things that we thought could be adjusted, in particular for this site and for this project. And as Brian mentioned, we're looking at creating active uses around the perimeter. We're looking at using building faces rather than fences. And we're looking at trying to create gateway moments that are punctuated by privately owned, publicly accessible open spaces, or POPs, which really start to create a stronger interface between the studio and the public realm. So we established some planning principles. You all saw this last time we presented. All of this is still very much in place with the project, reserving the space for the public waterfront, dividing the project into urban blocks, maintaining a film-friendly campus by establishing a secure perimeter that is not defined by fences as much as it's defined by architectural elements, creating human scale frontages that have a variety of materials and scales, and then having placemaking moments at each of these pop opportunities. We wanted to express the uses authentically for both the stages, the production offices, and production support. So the architectural identity of the project is one which uses those components and tries to create a refined industrial palette around each of those individual programmatic elements. And of course, this will be one of the most sustainable production facilities in the world. Brian mentioned it's zero greenhouse gas emissions, all electric facility. That's a first for HCP and perhaps one of the first in the world. So we're really excited about that. And the implementation of the Toronto Green Standards really served, again, as a point of guidance and an opportunity to really innovate on the sustainability aspects of production studios. Studio organization, lots of different things happening on the studio lot. Everything from stages to backlot to production office and support spaces. The overall program is very much similar to where you saw last time. Minor shifts, which are not about necessarily massing, but are more about the operational side, all of which really fall under a singular umbrella of the production studio use established in the zoning. And this overall planning is divided into 4 quads, so I might be referring to some of those. Each quad has a collection of stages, production office, production support, and is related to primary entries from the north along Basin Street. So this is the overall site plan. Minor revisions that have occurred during the SPA process. Gotten lots of great feedback, and there's been collaboration between planning and the design team and the client to try to make sure that we're responding as best we can to all of the interests and demands of creating a really powerful urban environment for this studio project. A few minor notes. There's now a publicly accessible right-of-way adjacent to our project site. So in the interim, before the Toronto Hydro facility here is changed into other uses, there's a possibility of accessing that future promenade space. We're maintaining right-of-ways within the project, which are secure within the footprint of the studio lot, but do maintain important view sheds and corridors, in particular along Logan to the Hearn Generating Station and to the McCleary incinerator. And we're also providing step backs at a number of points for gates. The 3 along the north side of the site that you see here are for production uses. So trucks and production equipment kind of come in and out from those sides. For the moment, the Broadview gate on the west side will not have access as it sits directly against that Toronto Hydro facility. And then in the future, the Waterfront gate on the south side will provide potential point of pedestrian access for studio users and the promenade. Each of those gates also represent opportunities to integrate both public and private open space, private open space on the interior sides of some of those gates and public open space on the exterior side, which really define those entry points through landscape and further opportunities to interface between the studio and the public realm. We've also worked to develop a preliminary art plan. Most of the opportunities for art, we hope, will exist along the promenade. And there's also possibilities of including some of those within the POPs that are part of the project, given that the timelines for development of the promenade itself and the studio site are on slightly different timelines. So we'll start here with a few of the updates after orientation. In terms of the Basin Street improvements that will be provided by the project, Basin Street right now has some existing rail infrastructure, a mix of curb, sidewalk, and undeveloped landscape edges. And the thing that we've had to design around as we've developed the planning and the street frontage is first and foremost providing production access, in particular for some of these larger vehicles that are needed for the delivery of equipment and the movement of people. So the site that or the developments to that landscape represent close collaboration with the city to provide a new sidewalk, planting zone, buffer space, and curb on the entirety of the basin frontage. And you can see a representation of that image here on the upper right. These are seen as production-friendly streets. They require these larger curb cuts, but they also include critical pedestrian elements like benches and trash cans, a bike share station, and others. Moving over to the Logan Gate, you can see that same vocabulary that's coming across the site here. And we'll talk more about the POPs specifically. This is really just to show you more about the streetscape developments themselves. Also worth noting is that everything about the site blocks are designed to allow for this future extensions of Carlaw and Logan. Logan here currently is part of private property between FedEx and that underutilized site with the gravel mound that Chris mentioned. And coming over to the far east side of the site, the turning basin is immediately to the right of this. The future promenade is to the right of this gate. Carlaw terminates at the Carlaw Gate here on the south terminus there. And a few things to note. One addition is to bring a little bit more green space and tree canopy onto this side of the site. This row of trees and an increased planting area here not only provide a more hospitable zone for pedestrian movement along the street, but also create a natural buffer to some of the production uses here in the backlot area, which is used for kind of vehicular staging and set building and really anything that's needed for those production environments. So that's an update that you'll see here along the Basin Street frontage. The other piece that we wanted to update on the architectural side is on the enclosure. As we were developing the design and as we spoke about last January, we were really inspired and interested in having a project which could echo Toronto's industrial heritage. And we talked about some of those attributes, this emphasis on verticality, masonry in the historic buildings, varied volumes, which we have kind of embedded in the site plan and massing, the nature of the working waterfront, and green filigree and signage, as we see in the distillery district, as elements which can come into the architecture to provide echoes of this industrial character. And this is still very much a part of the project. And I think the effort that we've made through a lot of hard work over the last year with the Hackman team and the design team is to carry that through into something which could really meet the demands of the current marketplace. Cost of construction, materials, and timelines, really driving a few changes that we think will help to make this project a reality while retaining a lot of the aspects that we talked about last time. So this is what you saw last January. for new panelists. Hopefully this is a point of orientation. This is the primary gate at Logan facing south. And this is the update. So there's a few key changes and a lot that stays the same. So the main changes are that the production stages have moved from a metal panel system to a prefabricated insulated precast panel, and the office liners that you see here in masonry are now a metal panel system. So there's really 4 primary facade types that you'll see across the site. There are the office facades, which are this insulated metal panel. There are the soundstage facades, which are the precast concrete panels, which have varying textures on the lower and upper registers and are integrated with stage graphics, lighting, and signage. We have the support facades, which are in these areas adjacent to the pass-throughs and in some of the mill buildings. And that vocabulary of the support facades also extends into this freestanding parking structure, which provides screening and 4 levels of above grade parking along with ground level mill spaces. So starting with some of the attributes of the metal panel facade, the goal here was to retain certain attributes of the refined industrial palette that we talked about before, in particular the modulation of the panel. We're looking for opportunities to make this simple, effective, but also special. So one thing that I think will be special about this facade in particular is that these metal panels are available in single panels that can be full height. So we can maintain a level of articulation and abstraction, which can be highly refined, while still retaining transparency and activation along critical street frontages through the inclusion of the window wall system and this distinctive green color that we've extracted from the Distillery District and other areas of Toronto and tried to bring into the project. The area that you're seeing immediately to the right here is one of these production support spaces, similar metal panel type and window wall system, but now in a more neutral silver that creates a division between the production offices and the stages, and then the stages themselves, which you'll see more detail on the next slide. So the stages are a precast flex wall panel system. The upper register is a flat and smooth concrete finish, and the lower register is a textured, vertically striated finish. That's something which starts to bring down the scale slightly. There are elements of lighting which are integrated into that panel structure, and then of course all of the features of elephant doors, production signage, and access are all worked into the modulation of that panel system. The garage itself is something that's had a lot of work to help create something which is flexible and is something that can also save on costs for the project. So in particular, this is a project that we've moved from a concrete structure to a prefabricated steel structure. It does reduce the embodied carbon of this particular component of the project. And there's a lot of aspects of the materials and finishes and screening, which will be very similar to what you all saw last time, really visually defined by this galvanized grating that can be a screening around the garage. So we'll just kind of walk you through a few of the key elevations. This is the south elevation, which would be along the promenade. This is actually stripping away all of the planting that you had seen last time, knowing that that will come in the future, and is something which will start to characterize that landscape space and create a sense of layering and buffering to the facades. This is at the intersection of the ship channel and the turning basin. The ship channel is on the left side of this image. The vocabulary extends around that edge. And we have a number of moments where we have private open spaces in the form of patios that are breakouts that allow for studio users to have a more direct connection with the exterior and a possibility of activating the waterfront edges. This is the west elevation. In the short term, this will not be immediately visible because of the Toronto Hydro facility that's immediately to the west of the site. So there's a substation there. But this is the facade of the heritage building that you're seeing here in the foreground, and then the stages in the background, and the mill building here to the right. And most critically, the touch points here for the project are about these gateway moments, which are defined by open spaces framed by architecture and planted in a way that they become this interface between the public and the studio. So just in summary, the main changes that you're seeing here to the enclosure, driven by close collaboration between our construction partners, Hackman, and the design team, to really find a way of making this project a reality under some of the constraints that we're all working with today in the construction and development market. I'll hand over to Ifan from Milk, who will walk you through some of the open space updates.
Thank you, James. As we know, the origin of Portland used to be a marshland. However, over time, the industrial development led to the loss of the ecological notion. The primary main aim of the landscape design now for the Basin Media project, therefore, is to rejuvenate the site's ecology, emphasizing extensive greenery, and also creating optimal habitats for both human and diverse species. Seasonality forms the core concept of our landscape design, where in the palette we've curated exhibits of distinct characteristics across varying seasons. In spring and summer, large trees such as oak and maple offer ample shade, shielding users from the direct sunlight. Additionally, decorative shrubs and flowering herbaceous plants bloom, infusing the landscape with vibrant colors. As autumn arrives, foliage transitions into a spectrum of hues, from brilliant yellow to deep reds, while fruit emerge from berry bushes in the understory. Come winter, deciduous trees shed their leaves, yet evergreen bushes persist, providing ground-level protection from harsh winds. Complementing this are ornamental shrubs like the red-stemmed dogwood, maintaining its striking red hue throughout the winter months. Here's an overview of the key species we've selected for the project. Refined in collaboration with urban forestry. For the prominent trees and pops, we've kept oaks, maples, and gums, while adding hackberry and hickory to diversify the mix. Along the Logan axis, columnar oaks remain, and we've also introduced ginkgo along the Basin Street frontage. Our shrub selection includes a blend of evergreen, decorative, and berry bushes, providing a variety of colors, textures, and food sources for birds. Additionally, we've also incorporated a range of ground cover species, combining flowering perennial with grass to support pollination. All chosen species are native to Ontario. Considering the snow removal, we've also carefully assessed the salt tolerance level of trees near the driveway or the ones that were planted at grade. To honor the site's industrial legacy, we proposed and refined industrial palette for the ground plane materials. Our pops and private plazas will feature unipavers and concrete, while Logan, as the main corridor, will have the combination of wood deck and unipaver to provide a sense of warmth. Most of the sites will be finished with asphalt given the daily studio operation. The driving surfaces will be demarcated to provide queuing, featuring a cool seal finish to minimize heat absorption. The material for the wood deck is carbony, an environmentally friendly engineered softwood designed to withstand harsh conditions. Unipavers will be cast concrete bricks from the Unilock, which would have 3 shades of gray and a slight tint of bluish green to complement the architectural facades. Concrete pavement will be cast in place with decorative joint pattern. Zooming into the Logan Gate, the design has evolved with increased entry widths to accommodate truck turning and fire truck access. We updated the security enclosure with separate checkpoints for both pedestrian and vehicular traffic, and wherever possible, we maximize the softscape area. The plaza features a space for small groups of gathering to the left and long-term bike parking to the right. Finished with wood deck and concrete planter walls, the driving surface will be finished with unipaver to distinguish itself from the plaza for visual queuing. At the Waterfront Gate, we've made significant enhancements to the softscape area, ensuring each tree benefits from a minimum soil volume of 30 cubic meters. This is achieved either through raised planters or below-grade soil cells. We've also opted to use unipavers for the private side of the plaza while maintaining a wood deck for the public side. The concept of an outdoor event space remains, featuring an articulated staging area between 2 rows of columnar oaks, enhancing the Logan access view corridor. On the private side of the plaza, users can enjoy timber benches, concrete planters with wood-cladded seating areas, and cast iron tree grates. The expanded softscape not only provides ample shading, but also allows for a greater variety of understory plants, offering distinctive colors and textures year-round. At the Heritage Gate, updates were made to accommodate truck turning and fire truck access, resulting in a reduction in the size of urban spaces. Now the plaza features a linear planter and a seating area on the private side. This corridor primarily serves pedestrian circulation and addresses grading differences. It will be paved with concrete, featuring a customized join pattern. At Carlo, similar to Logan and Heritage Gates, we've adjusted the entry width to accommodate truck turning. Additionally, we've redesigned the security enclosure to include separate access points for pedestrians and vehicles. We expanded the softscape area to provide more plant communities. On the private side, the hardscape plaza remains intact, featuring timber benches for seating. And instead of the wood deck from the previous scheme, now this plaza will be finished with unipavers for long-term durability. Lastly, the Bouchard Gate Plaza will be exclusively private, with an increased emphasis on softscape to create a greater sense of enclosure. It will be finished with unipavers and timber benches for seating.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that concludes all the presentations, so we can move to questions and comments. And I remind everybody, it's 4:05. We're supposed to conclude this item at 4:30. So if you can keep your questions and comments focused, it would really be appreciated. So who wants to start with questions? Patty.
Thanks. Just a quick question. For the plaza, the Waterfront Gate Plaza, can you explain why the fence and enclosure is where it is? And what is the material of that fence? It looks like it's sliced 2/3, 1/3 in the middle of the plaza. So what determined the offset and what is that gate made of?
Which?
Slide. Just the one that's titled Waterfront Gate. You can see that there's.
Are you able to see the screen now?
Yeah.
That one right
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you repeat the question again? The materials you're asking about?
There looks like there's a fence, like a gate right in the middle, dividing a public portion and a private portion of this plaza. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah, that's right.
So
So
what?
the gray area is the private portion and the brown is public. And our
Right.
property line is at the edge of the brown where the promenade is. So the brown component we are dedicating as a pop.
So my question is, how did you determine where it is and why and where? What's the proportion? Why didn't it go all the way to the edge? Why wasn't it closer to the front? How did you decide to divide the public versus the private in a specific spot?
I think a lot of it, so we have a big grade change here. So I think the grade change was driving like where exactly that fence line landed. And we also wanted to provide, some area within the site for people who are working to have outdoor private areas. Security is very highly regarded for film studio campuses, as you all are well aware. So having a fence there is absolutely necessary. But I think, Ifan, I don't know if you recall exactly what was the driver for where that line was drawn, other than, just sort of the grading and design articulation.
Yeah.
I can take a quick pass at that too. Or go ahead, Ivan.
Yeah, I just want to add, there was also this intention to provide a big open spaces for public events, and then it should be big enough to accommodate at least 500 people. So, this was designed in kind of syncing up with the promenade design before. But right now you are only seeing the part that's within the property line. So that's why it might be a little bit hard to understand.
Is it just a chain link fence or is there some design?
The material, yeah. So the fence will be galvanized steel. But there's also this green steel gateway structure sitting right there.
Okay. Yep. Alina Marie, any questions?
No, I don't have any questions. Well,
Okay.
sorry, I do.
We do.
I was just wondering if there were materials sampled.
Yeah, they're back.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should,
Where
are they?
So James, Craig from Adamson brought some samples. It's just, oh, Chris, sorry. It's just right around here. Do you want to walk us through what we're looking at here? I don't know if you can see it.
I believe that you have a metal panel sample and a color swatch, which describe the texture of that insulated metal panel, which has a subtle vertical striation, which echoes some of what's happening on the stages. And then that would be finished with a custom color, which I believe you also have the swatch for there as well. I'm not sure exactly which of those samples is which, but there's one particular metal panel profile which is intended for the project, which is a relatively even but subtle vertical texture.
Sorry, I'll get into it later. I'll show this. So you can see.
Yep, that's the one. Thank you, Chris.
Okay.
Appreciate that.
Okay. Any other questions?
I guess the only other one that Spotty and I are looking at together is, are we correct in seeing that there's only one? Is one green roof still planned for that southwest or southeast corner?
So
all of
we,
the production, go ahead, Carol.
oh no, go ahead, James.
All of the production office spaces do still have the green roofs. So those are the volumes that are not the stages. For stages, that's not been practical because of the weight of those systems on long span structures. But the production offices still retain those green roofs.
And the solar, and well, actually, I'll leave that to Kevin.
We don't have to, please, go ahead.
I know that was part of what we're being asked to consider. And can you just maybe direct my attention to where the solar voltaics are?
There will not be solar photovoltaics installed day one. That was a cost saving measure. We hope that those can be installed in the future. The stage roofs are a great opportunity to do that, and it is a common thing to be able to do. We're really looking at trying to make sure that this project can become a reality. So we have space on the roofs for future installations, but they will not be installed initially.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Eric, any questions?
Yeah, two questions. On page, is so along page 40, I think it's 43. There's along, especially around the green facade, those are the offices. Why is there a fence that is basically, you explain the fence between those green buildings, which I think are the offices, versus having a fence right basically against the facade? Like just trying to understand the purpose.
So those are patio spaces. So those are kind of spill out areas for the studio users to be able to interface more directly with the promenade. The fence is something which is needed at least in the interim condition for security, and also provides a buffer between individual exits from the stages and the public realm. So we need some kind of controlled enclosure along that edge. The goal there was to create something that could be highly transparent and provide views for people who would be using those as amenity spaces within the studio.
James, could you bring the slide up, James, just for everyone on the call?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks.
Is there a cross section of what that might be? Because it's not like on the scale of the site plan. Looks like it's only is it a foot? I mean, it looks like it's a couple of feet or 3 feet or maybe.
So
It's definitely more than 3 feet. So the other issue that I mentioned previously is that we have a pretty significant grade change between our site and the promenade. We're actually raising our site up so that we don't have to dig down as much given the contaminated nature of the site. So we have, and it's a large site, so grades are very challenging. And exiting off of this side of the building has proved to be pretty challenging as well. So there is some sloping that happens outside, especially the stages, because we can't slope for any egress inside a soundstage. So that's also a driver for some of those fenced in areas. So it maintains that secure perimeter while also accommodating like egress code requirements, especially adjacent to sound stages. So I know here it looks like it's like right up on the building, but it's not. Ifan, do you have maybe a plan of this will help?
Yeah, I think
on the
that's,
drawing, if there's any space, so.
this is probably a good description. You can see there's a few locations where we have those on flanking either side of the ship channel plaza and gate. And there's one also here at the corner of the ship channel in the turning basin.
I'm not as concerned about these necessarily, but then it's the entire length of everything else that is in between those. Okay.
All right, let's keep going. I'm gonna go to Jana next. I know you have to leave at 4:30. Are you still there, Jana? Maybe she's already left, but it's not 4:30. Anyway, okay, press on. Pat? Any?
No questions.
No questions. Wonderful. Okay. Betsy? Any questions, Betsy?
Oh, yeah. First question is the artwork that was noted just diagrammatically in an early slide. Is it possible to put those art dollars into a facade art treatment?
Yes.
Yeah, right now we have kind of all options on the table. So as part of the SPA process, we submitted a draft public art plan. We don't really have a prescribed vision of what that is going to look like. We have identified various options, one of which would be facade application or application along a fence line at our base camp area, a 3D sculptural element, lighting element. There's just a huge range of applications that could apply to the project. And I think, you know, our approach is going to be that we go through an RFP process, and we intend to have 100% of the art be Indigenous focused. So we've been in conversation with a few people that are going to, you know, help us manage that process. And through that RFP process, we hope to bring kind of a variety of various proposals in terms of how they approach the site and what's appropriate. But we are very we're open-minded at this point. We don't have a prescribed vision of what that public art is going to look like. We really want to leave it up to the process.
Okay, my second question is about the end of car law. At the last meeting, we had a lot of commentary on the end of car law. So it's got to be better, pull the building back, improve it, because it was just end of car law terminating in a driveway. It seems to have gotten worse. So I want to give you the opportunity to talk about that now, because that's where my comments are going to be landing.
Sure. Maybe Ifan, do you want to bring the plan up for car law entrance? So yeah, we did. You know, it's tough. I have to say, like, since we were last here, we have overcome a lot of hurdles on this project, even to keep it alive from a budget standpoint. So, you know, we're doing the best that we can. We did evaluate stacking the offices. We evaluated remassing several areas, and just none of those options were economically feasible. You know, once we stack higher than 3 stories, we're dealing with a whole new structural system. And we are very constrained given the amount of program that we have on this site. I mean, this studio campus has to support a parking structure. No other campuses, you know, in Toronto have a parking structure. So that just gives you an idea of how constrained we are on the land. We also have the requirement of new basin and the road network and the bisecting of our site, which is also really constrained where we can develop. So, one thing I want to emphasize, because we're kind of abstractly looking at these plans, but 18 meters for the promenade is fairly significant, especially when you're standing out on the site. So yes, this, Carla, road expansion is going to end in, at our studio site. Adjacent to that is also going to be the 18-meter strip for the promenade that extends beyond our site and adjacent to Carla. So, I want to emphasize that we heard you, we looked at options, and unfortunately, no mitigation approaches were economically feasible for us. We did have to expand the driveway, like as Ifan mentioned, multiple driveways were studied, and this was also, a lot of work that came through the SPA process. And, we have very large vehicles that we have to accommodate, and unfortunately, the turning radiuses were just in conflict with the previous design planters. In lieu of that, we have added quite a bit of landscaping via the SPA process, both on our site and on Basin Street. So, I know Ifan highlighted that, but we have tried to do improvements where we can to soften this. So we added an entire line of trees adjacent to our base camp area, which Ifan, maybe you can click over to that slide because it's right adjacent to this. So we had a little more, so that entire line of trees, which is on our site, is in addition to the street trees that we also added. So, additional landscaping along Basin Street, a mobility station, we've added a ton via the SPA process. And, unfortunately, remassing the buildings isn't something that's going to be feasible for our project.
Okay, thank you. David.
Just a couple of quick questions. So thank you for the really robust planting strategy that you have brought to the site. I do have a couple of questions on that. One is the plant material selection. I'm concerned that despite the fact that we're referencing the native flora of the marshes, that the selection doesn't necessarily align with that. For example, ginkgo and English oak. And I'm wondering, are those decisions being driven by urban forestry at the City of Toronto, or are they your choices to bring into the site? There seems to be a bit of a disconnect there with those.
Ifan, you want to take that question and maybe just talk about some of the feedback we've gotten via SPA and Indigenous outreach and in our approach to the planting palette?
Yeah, so I think from the previous presentation, we presented more kind of marshlandy species. But, we got a feedback regarding the long-term kind of a maintenance about it. And then also a lot of the grasses are going to appear on the promenade. But right now, as we are only focusing on the studio campus, I think we are going to reduce the amount of the marshland species. Instead, we are going to emphasize a lot more on the understory shrub species and the flowering perennials. Ginkgo trees was only used at the street frontage because of its durability in the urban conditions. But other places within the campus, it will be primarily maples and the oaks, large shading trees.
Yeah, and then just a quick follow-up question on that, and that is, who's going to maintain all of this? Is this going to be the responsibility of the studio ultimately, or is the City of Toronto going to have some role in this, which is a bit terrifying, frankly?
We are maintaining all of the landscape on our studio site. So the only, and the Basin Street landscaping as well. That's a requirement per the SPA process. The promenade will be, which is not part of this presentation, but just, for your own information, the promenade will be maintained by Toronto Parks.
Okay. Kevin.
Thank you. Can you describe to me what your strategy is to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions for this site?
The most direct answer is that this is an all electric facility. There's no gas coming onto the site, and that's part of the that's really the primary gesture to get towards zero greenhouse gas emissions.
Sure. So this is going to be a ground source heat pump?
No, not a ground source heat pump. We have.
Can somebody give me some detail about how you're going to? You mentioned you're not going to put PVs on site. There's going to be no on-site renewables. So how are we going to net out the greenhouse gas emissions?
There's no. There are no emissions for the energy production that's happening on site. So that's not necessarily mechanical systems selection. That's part of the kind of planning guidelines that were part of the project, and the zero greenhouse gas emissions is about the energy being provided to the site coming from clean sources.
Right. So it's going to be green energy offsets that are going to net out the emissions for this project?
I don't believe there's any offsets planned for this project. Carol, maybe you can.
Which emissions are we specifically referencing?
Well, all energy has emissions associated with it. The electricity from the Ontario grid has a carbon content. So I'm very happy to hear that you're making it all electric. We do have a low carbon grid. However, we do have a carbon footprint. So if you are advertising that you're going to be net zero greenhouse gas emissions, how are you achieving that?
Well, I don't know, I just want to walk back a little bit. I don't know that we said, if we use the term net zero and your interpretation of that is maybe a little bit different, what we were trying to relay is that there's no gas coming to this site. That's a huge cost burden for this project, and one in which we're committed to. And so I think, as part of Hackman is MBS, which is like one of the largest operators in the world. None of their campuses are operated without gas. This is the very first one. So I just want to emphasize, it may be we may not be meeting, the level in which, you're defining net zero, but we are doing a lot. This is very groundbreaking for a studio to be operating on zero gas, especially for heating. These are large volumes, so it's not just like the cost of installing electric to support that, which there is no public infrastructure to support this project currently. So there's a huge cost premium just for bringing the power to the site. But there's also an operational premium long-term for us to use electric. So, I just want to emphasize the positives, and, this is something we're committed to as a company. Unfortunately, there are just economic constraints. We can't enlist everything, and we've tried our best to sort of pick and commit to things that we can achieve economically.
Well, thanks for explaining that. In your deck here, you say net zero GHG emissions. So that's what I was asking about. So thank you very much.
Thanks for the feedback, and we'll definitely update it so it's clearer in the future, and apologies if that was misleading in any way.
Okay, I have one very simple question, and then we'll go right to comments. I understand that the promenade is in the capital budgets at 2023 to 2032. So it's a big, long time there. What happens in the interim, and would it be fenced off? Would the public have access to that area in front of the studio along the water's edge, or what's the answer there?
Chris, do you want to take that one? Because it's a question related to the promenade, and I think from our perspective, it's very much TBD, but others in the room maybe have a little more info.
Yeah, I can speak to it at a very high level, but the promenade design, both the interim and the ultimate condition, are still being worked out through the design process. So I can't answer the specifics right now.
I understand it may take a while. I'm just wondering what happens after the studio is built. Say you don't get this promenade funded and designed for 5, 6, 7, 10 years. I don't know. Is it going to be fenced off? Can the public still have access to it even, what? I just need some sense.
I can answer that. So Apologies, everybody. Scott Pennington. I'm the VP at Creatio responsible.
Can you speak up? Sorry.
Sorry, I haven't spoken in a couple hours, so it's been quiet.
It's all right. Now's your chance.
Scott Pennington, VP responsible for port lands at Creatio. So the promenade lands are currently under title to Creatio's affiliate Tedco. So they are privately owned in the sense that they're not owned by the city. So the intention is that those lands will be improved and conveyed to the city in time. There's actually council direction to that effect in terms of including budget for this work. We are currently working with PFNR to identify what the timeline for that budget and ultimate construction of the promenade will be. We're hoping that that will be done concurrent with the studio, and that once the studio is open, that the promenade will also be publicly accessible. If that does not happen, and we're not at a point right now where we can answer that conclusively, then the lands would not be conveyed to the city, and likely we'd have to look at some kind of access control because there would be no operations or maintenance of that site. So that's the situation that we face right now. But we're of course working diligently with city staff.
That's why I'm asking. I don't care what happened. Of course I care, but the fact matters. People will want to walk along that water's edge. I don't care if they might climb over a fence. They'll want to get there.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm going. You know.
Yeah, well, we're certainly not going to have improvements made to the promenade that are not accessible to the public, right? So it would be a continuation of what's there today, or ideally we're in a situation where we've been able to get budget and advance the improvement, and then, you know, the intention would be to make that publicly accessible as soon as
All
possible.
right, no more questions. All right, let's go to comments. It's now 4:30 when we're supposed to have wrapped up. So if you could be focused and clear with your comments, I'd appreciate it. Ma'am.
I can
Nina
be
Marie.
focused and clear. Thank you. I appreciate the emphasis on sustainability, which is how you began your presentation to us, but notwithstanding that we've established now that there is no net zero, I think there are other opportunities that befit a project of this privileged location, one of which is obviously the solar voltaics, and I'd like to hear that those are in budget and in scope, given the sustainability commitment that's been articulated. The other thing that seems to me to be a missed opportunity, or perhaps it's there, but I didn't see it, rainwater collection. Rain is a resource in this part of the world. We certainly are dealing with a climate situation that demands we deal with it constructively. And I appreciated very much your landscape initiation to talk about the historic location being wet, and that there is a resource to be harvested here. Certainly if you're planting trees that need that, and notwithstanding that you've peeled back a little bit the emphasis on music species or wetland-based species, you still do have black gums or tupelo trees, you've got silver maples, all of which could be value engineered, let's say, to use rainwater on site in a really creative way, and in a particular way that befits the public realm. I appreciate that you've done this long additional planting of trees. We asked you to pull them back from the building a little bit so that they don't resemble a kind of nature band-aid stuck on the building. But given the species you're specifying and their height ranges in ideal locations, I feel like you'd be more honest, honestly, to say this isn't a native planting situation. It's just not. So don't say that it is, because a third of the species are not native, then that's okay. I think there's a good rationale for that if you want them to be hardy. But if cost constraints are really the issue that we're hearing about, then let's use the wild and dirty species that are already there. Why not use river birch, sumac, and cedar, by the way, which have native and indigenous importance? They're already on the site. They're super hardy. They don't need a lot. Poplars, fast growing. There's a lot you could choose from, and I think some of the comments were already getting at that. So I feel like there's this weird tension and disconnect between needing to value engineer and be cost conscious, but also emphasize native plants, and the palette really doesn't do either of those things. So I think you can probably reach for that and be successful. But it brings me to the bigger question, which I know others are going to say as well. I'll be super focused about it. Our job, or at least my job sitting here, is to advocate for design excellence on an incredibly privileged site, one of the most privileged sites in our city, which is being magnificently rebuilt, reconnected, and revitalized. And I'm not doing my job if I don't call this out as not design excellence. And if the constraints are so significant, and notwithstanding that you've done your very best to meet them. There are, of course, other sites with fewer constraints, not as privileged, not sitting on this incredible location, facing the water that's been completely redone. So I would like this project to live up to that. And I would most of all like the corners, the edges, and these gates to be places of public prominence, understanding that you're a private enterprise on our most privileged site. That's all I have for now.
Okay, thank you. Fatty?
Thank you so much for the presentation. For me, it was a little bit of going back and checking for a detailed design presentation. It feels like we lost some of the details that were so elegant in the previous presentation. Usually they come back progressed and not regressed. And for me, for example, like things like, the font calling out Basin Studios, some of the material palettes that even though they could be simplified, sometimes just seem to be a little bit in contest with each other. I'm thinking, the two Flexwell texture panels all of a sudden, could be articulated in ways that actually promoted what was so elegant in the previous project. Last but not least, in terms of the landscape, I'm really not convinced with your answer about what you're doing and why you're putting the fence where you're putting it in the place where the public and the private are interfacing. This plaza, you mentioned 500 people. I find that very hard to imagine. But at the same time, this is the spot where the people from outside the city are coming to meet the project and its closest point. And for some reason, it was unclear to me why the fence was where it is, where you could be placing it in a way that actually celebrates the program on the inside while welcoming people to a certain extent to your site and to the project. And things like, the fence materials, you just mentioned it was going to be some kind of galvanized steel, a detailed design. I really want to know what that looks like, because that's the thing that people are going to be seeing. So, without harping too many of the things, I think this project is really significant. And I think as film studios go, it's one of the most elegant that we've seen so far. And I just want to keep the spirit of what was presented in the previous presentation, understanding, of course, all the economic constraints that come with it, but notwithstanding, again, the significance of the site, as previously been mentioned, as a privileged, incredible cultural project. It's not just a production project. It's not just a economic project, but it has cultural significance because it is creating culture within the waterfront as well. So I just want to think of it as framed in that sense. So thanks for that.
Okay, Betsy.
If anyone can make an interesting composition out of modest materials, it would be SOM LA. Like you go to LA and you see great, interesting buildings composed in unexpected ways out of materials that none of us would ever think to use, just because they're, of your environment, they're cheap and cheerful, So you had us in the last meeting with the brick facade because you had this elegant, simple kind of moment down by the waterfront. Now that you've got composite panels, I think you're stuck in a position where you're trying to maintain the design intent using a material that isn't going to give it to you no matter how hard you try. You cannot be neutral about the type or location of the art that's going onto this building. It's an opportunity to use that funding, frankly, for something that's going to improve your facades. If you can't do it in these materials, you're going to have to do it through another way. So get really creative about that. When we toured the Generations House in Aarhus last year, they had this fabulous wood central stair. They had $0 to build this intergenerational living facility. So they used the art funding to make the stair. They said the program is the stair, and all of the money for art went into this like great central atrium. Otherwise, it would have been nothing. If you want, so I mean, that's kind of the crux of it. I mean, Marie said it so well about the site and having to be exceptional. This building is a problem right now, and we're really counting on the architect and landscape team to bring it up in a way that's unexpected. Look at composition of panels, look at the end of Carlaw is just not acceptable. And I think we need to have a rethink on a couple of areas of this program right now. Not the program, the facade, the art, and the landscape.
Okay, thank you. Pat, any comments?
It's kind of tough. I have to just say that my comments are a little bit similar to the last time, but it is it's a place where there's so much creative work that takes place, and I just don't see the project being kind of, it doesn't feel creative to me. I don't know. It just seems very, I mean, and I guess I can say this even though you got complete approval last time, considering the value engineering that's taken place on the buildings. But there's something, it just leaves me sort of, it's ordinary, notwithstanding the kind of, thoughtful presentation. It still just ends up looking like industrial buildings that really aren't contributing. So I think last time I said, why don't you do more with the sort of super graphics? I think Betsy's asking for, kind of public art on the facades. I would be looking in the landscape, can you put lines on a parking lot that look more interesting than just the regular, like it's kind of regular. And so to that end, I mean, I don't really have any great comments because I think we're sort of at the end of this, but it's a little bit disappointing, frankly. Yeah, I think I would agree with all of my colleagues' comments. And just one last thing so that when you get NOAC from the city, you have to put in a deposit on your landscape to ensure that you build what's on those drawings. So just so you know, the value engineering, if there's value engineering thoughts for the landscape going forward, that would be very difficult for you. That's all.
Okay, thanks. Eric?
Thank you. I'm going to echo a lot of my colleagues' comment. To me, is I'm going to focus on the, I think a new member mentioned it well, the edge. It's the edges of the project, the interaction with the city, the public nature of where we're walking, what we're adjacent to. And I think that I would agree that I feel like from the last time to this time, the project has kind of lost some of that shine. Like I'm looking, for example, at your parking structure. I have no issue with the parking structure, where it's located and so on and so forth, but your reference project is that you have on your sheet, I found it better, and because you're putting a kind of a smooth blank wall at the ground floor adjacent to the sidewalk. It's harsh. We're basically, and I understand the security regarding that. I mean, I've designed some courthouse and that has to be secured. But the treatment of these ground floor has texture, has articulation, has things, maybe a little bit of transparency. So I think that around the edges, so the parking lot, around the parking structure, for example, something that can be that should be improved in terms of that relationship with the public. The key entrances, I think, as was mentioned here, as needs to be, I think, just from a public realm improved. I understand the safety part, and I understand especially around the basin, but where they have those public places, but I don't see any cross section. I don't understand the characteristic, the relationship between the basin edge and the building. It looks like there's almost no space. It's a bit. I think the security there should be at the building face, not creating a kind of a little space. Which frankly, I think that you're talking about, okay, you can exit the building, but it's like in my neighborhood, if I have to start to put a giant fence right at the edge of the sidewalk, if you exit, you just exit into the basin. I think you can actually secure your building at the edge, which I think is quite doable. And yeah, you can fence in those smaller pocket park or outdoor spaces that you have. That's perfect, but it should not be this entire or a huge amount of length in a place that we actually are, is going to be at some point very much a prime public promenade in the future. So that I think should be reconsidered. And whatever other fencing, completely agree with Fadi that I don't know what a galvanized, I know what a galvanized steel is, but there's probably 70 different types. So that, since it's going to be quite prime in many locations, I think we need to know what that is. So again, it's all of the edges of the project and how they respond to the public, to people being adjacent to it. It should have a it should feel like it has a human scale and a kind of a natural, sensitive integration with its surrounding.
Okay, thank you, David.
Yeah, just going back to my question, I think this project, because it's the first out of the gate in a sense in this area, literally and figuratively, I guess to some degree, it's going to be an exemplar for the in this area. And I really think the just to go back to this whole plant material issue, I really appreciate that the landscape hasn't been value engineered like the building has. But I think it's really critical that the landscape tie in with the marshes and the natural heritage of this area. And it's got to be right. And it's going to be the first one. So it really has to set the example. So whatever urban forestry might be saying to you, whatever you're hearing at the SPA comments, you really need to go back and say that's not acceptable here. It needs to be native, and it needs to reference that natural heritage. It's critically important, I think, this project.
Okay, Kevin.
Thank you. I guess in terms of comments, there's been a bit of a misunderstanding in terms of the system design. Net zero emissions is an extremely well-defined term and concept. It's defined in the Toronto Green Standard. ASHRAE has a definition for it. So, I was pretty excited when I read it. So I guess when understanding now that that's not the full approach, I understand that now. So I guess I do actually want to commend you on electrifying the system, because it will be a low carbon system. So I do agree that that's very often a challenge, and so I do commend it. But I do want to reiterate that it's not an ambiguous term.
Okay, I think we're all finished here, so I'll do my best to try and summarize here. I think what you've heard from the panel is the obvious. First of all, that this is a prime special site on the water, and as you all know, Waterfront Toronto is undertaking a massive revitalization of the Don River adjacent to this area. So that's perhaps why we're so focused on achieving the best that can possibly happen on this site. I think the second overall theme is that people have said they're basically disappointed in comparing this to what we had before us in the past. It seems that value engineering, perhaps, which is always a reality, has taken over with respect to the building, for sure. But we have suggested several ways in which perhaps you can still further address our concerns through, first of all, the focus on natural vegetation that's indicative to the heritage of the area and of the marsh, as opposed to the species of trees that have been suggested. Some concerns about make sure there's provision for solar in the future. The opportunity for rainwater collection should be part of the strategy for the trees that will do very, very well there, and the vegetation that will flourish. There's been an obvious concern about the material palettes that have been used, which are different than what we saw last time, and concerns about such things as the fence location, the lack of art, and the ability to perhaps compensate for the material change with the use of public art on the facades. There's a real concern about, and a real disappointment about, the end of Carlaw, that we thought that was a real high priority, that that should be adjusted, the building should be adjusted so the view of Carlaw would be uninterrupted. So that was a disappointment. And I guess overall, various people have said that, which is kind of ironic for a studio, you've done a lot of things, you push the envelope quite a bit compared to other studios that exist around the world, but it still doesn't feel creative, and it feels kind of ordinary. And so I guess it kind of leaves us a bit flat We want you to pay more attention to how the edges relate to the public. And we hope, we understand where this sits in the approval process, but we hope that these suggestions in terms of the vegetation, the use of public art, and perhaps another kick at the can in terms of the foot of Carlisle Street could still be achieved, and can make this as positive as possible given the location. The last thing I want to say is, related to the question I asked about the promenade. I understand that's not part of the scope, but I would love to see some sort of strategy, some sort of opportunity to have the public still access the promenade, even though it is not going to be completely funded and designed. I mean, there's lots of interim conditions, and I just know that people are going to want to go there. They may break down the gate or climb over the fence or whatever, but they're going to want to be there. I really encourage you to try and pay more attention to that interim condition. So I guess that sort of leaves us where we are. We do have to take a vote on this, and I'm in the hands of the panel, but it doesn't appear that there is the full support as we had last time. That is what I'm hearing from the panel. Unless anyone else wants to say anything different, please speak up.
I think a conditional vote is kind of where my head's at.
Conditional?
Relative, because it's we understand how complicated film studios are. There's no question.
Yeah.
And so it's not like a rethink the project. It's a focus on the art, facades, the fences, the landscape system.
Strategy.
In the tandem with
The opportunities that we still think are there, basically.
Well, that the site deserves.
I mean, as detailed design is when you see the details that seem to have disappeared.
I think that's what we expected, so.
Yeah.
So I'm fine with that, if with the motion of conditional support for the panel.
I'm sorry, can we outline what the conditional support would be based on? That wasn't quite clear just from the viewers on screen.
It would be, we're supporting with conditions. We understand, we're just advisory to the city. You and the city will proceed accordingly. But we've offered various suggestions in terms of how you can compensate for the areas that we felt should have been addressed today, and related to the vegetation, the opportunities for rainwater collection, public art on the facades of the building, pay more attention to the edges and how the public interacts with it. All these kinds of things that'll be documented in a minute.
It'll be all in the list we'll give you.
We'll give you a full list.
Okay, I appreciate that. And as always, this is a spirited conversation, and obviously a wealth of collective experience and different purviews about design quality, design excellence in the room there. And so I know our team's always really appreciative of the thoughts and suggestions and questions as part of this. There's clearly a ton of material we could present and we could go into in these meetings. So it is a little bit challenging to speak to some of those levels of quality or materiality, or really get into the dimensionality of those exterior spaces and what that truly feels like. This is a mammoth building next to a series of pedestrian scale spaces. So I think at times things are out of perspective from a pedestrian standpoint. That aside, again, and Carol and I and the team here for the last year have really done a very diligent job of balancing a project that we can, meet the expectations of this panel, ensure that the city of Toronto and its residents would be proud of, but also balance that with economic feasibility and operational requirements to deliver a world-class studio. And so that's just, there's a clear and ever-present tension in that regard. There's always room to improve, but that's the balance we've really tried to strike in this next evolution. So we, as always, appreciate the comments and the time that's spent reviewing our project with us. And we will take the list when it's provided to us into consideration.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments. Okay, so hearing no one opposed, I guess we have a unanimous vote of conditional support. And that concludes this item. So thank you very much. We understand how complicated and difficult this has been, but we still think there are opportunities that, the door isn't closed yet. So we hope you can follow up on our suggestions.